This story begins with the fact that on a beautiful sunny day, a wanderer wrapped in a cloak was walking along the road. It was then that old entries in the diary of one villager began. A new resident came to their village. Then the young man with brown hair put the rake on his shoulder and looked at the man who had come. The expression on the stranger's face was not favorable, but the elders still came out to him and greeted him. The wanderer's eyes were full of anger, as if something terrible had happened in his life. Personally, the peasant did not want him to live here, but the good-natured elder of the village shook the stranger's hand and accepted the stranger with a smile. Then he had no choice but to ignore what had happened. 3 days had passed since the young man settled in the village. The folding doors of his house had not opened even once. He was so quiet that the peasant sometimes forgot about his existence. A couple of residents began to approach the stranger's house and show interest in him, but he, not paying attention to them, passed by. He, as before, was indifferent. A week passed, followed by 3 more days from the arrival of the stranger. Looking at the swaying branches of the trees, the peasant learned what the stranger was doing. The kids peeked through the fence and told him, repeating the movements of the wanderer with sticks. It turned out that the stranger trained with a sword every day. Putting the rake on his shoulder and taking the bucket in his hand, the guy began to go to work, while he thought about the wanderer, looking at whom one could understand that there were a whole bunch of stories in his past, but he still didn't care about him. A month later, moss and other vegetation began to grow on the door and stone walls of the stranger. But even so, the young man continued to train in his yard. The peasant did not see this, he heard it. Peeling the potatoes, the peasant tried not to listen to the conversation of the people standing in front of him. After the moment the wanderer arrived, a month passed, but no changes occurred. The wanderer learned to wield a sword, and the villagers gossiped about him. Some assumed that the wanderer was preparing for someone, sometimes to take revenge, others that he is a fallen knight or some famous mercenary. Cutting off the potato skins with a knife, the peasant tried not to pay attention to the numerous conversations of people because he was sincerely not interested. While plowing his garden, the peasant nevertheless decided to go and see the wanderer's training, his daily activities for 6 months. Drops flowed down the peasant's face while he pondered the fact that curiosity nevertheless appeared in him. But here anyone would not have been able to stand it. He was interested in how fast, how strong the wanderer was, what techniques he had honed, because it was not for nothing that he was a regular in the neighbor's gossip. Then looking through the broken part of the door into the wanderer's courtyard, the young man was disappointed. He saw how the wanderer stood in a stance holding his sword. Sweat flowed down his face and hands, to the villagers who knew nothing about the art of wielding a sword. The young man might seem incredible, but he does not agree with them. While he was engaged in trade, he had to see a couple of knights, and a wanderer is far from improbable. The peasant frowned at the guy. He must have had his own reasons not to stop, so compelling that they tormented his soul. Based on what he saw, he could say that the young man had not figured out how to resolve them, raising the bag over his shoulder again. The peasant went about his business. Although he felt sorry for the wanderer, he decided not to interfere. Having satisfied his curiosity, he could now forget about him. A new family appeared in the village, a retired mercenary, his son and daughter. Upon arrival, they were all smiling and fooling around. The smiling girl's name was Ramat. She was very beautiful. Her smile amazed the peasant. Then he decided to start a conversation with her the next day. Writing on a piece of paper with a pen under the light of a candle, the peasant wrote that after 3 years, that wanderer was still waving his sword. An inexplicably strange mood led him to take up his pen and paper for the first time in a long time. The peasant turned his head and looked at Rem sleeping on the bed and smiled. He looked after her for 2 years, and in the end she agreed to become his wife. On such days he doesn't need anything more to be happy. A moment later, the peasant stopped smiling, remembering the wanderer. The guy with whom he had absolutely nothing in common continued to appear in his thoughts. 5 years later, while everyone was happy, sad and laughing, the wanderer still waved his sword indifferently, day after day. This forced the peasant to ask himself how long his asceticism would continue. That's when he decided to watch him every day. He survived for 5 years, 1 month and 12 days. The young man trained with a sword. As if turning over the pages of his diary, the peasant described how even 5 years later, for months and 15 days, the young man trained with a sword. Another page of the diary turned over when 6 years, 2 months and 18 days had passed since the young man began training. The page of the diary was turned over again. This time it was winter, 6 years, 9 months and 3 days later a lot of snow fell, but the wanderer still continued to train. Another sheet of the diary was written down and turned over. Then he and Ruma had a child, a beautiful daughter named Lola. All the villagers then came to congratulate them. The diary sheets filled up one after another and fell to the ground. The young man continued his training. While numerous pages of the diary fell to the ground, the wanderer swung his sword in the courtyard and continued to train. Even after 7 years, 10 months and 27 days had passed. The wanderer's huge sword rose sharply into the air in the utter darkness of the night. The weather changed. There was a terrible downpour. The sky was filled with clouds, but not paying attention to the weather, the wanderer, whose hair had grown considerably, continued to hold the hilt of his sword and train. The peasant wrote in his diary with a pen, 15 years have passed, unfortunately. He forgot to check whether the stranger was engaged in training. The peasant, who had grown a beard and mustache, massaged his forehead, suggesting that the wanderer was still training, because his training was as natural as the dawn in the morning and the moon in the sky at night. The screams of his grandson calling him forced the peasant to open his eye and wake up. The grandfather raised his head and looked at his grandson, and then smiled at the boy with a smile on his face, who called him a sleepyhead. The peasant lying on the bed looked at LOL, who was scolding his son for disturbing his grandfather. Smiling, Lola told her son to go get ready, because they were leaving soon. When Juice turned around and ran to get ready, and Grandpa began to get up, turning to Lola, who asked him if he was awake. When the father threw off the blanket, Lola, who was standing nearby, asked her father if he would go with them to the market in the neighboring village. The old man waved his hand, saying that he would stay. The old man looked out the window as his daughter and grandson, holding hands, left the house. Looking up at the sky, he saw the same trees swaying in the wind and a blue sky with clouds as many years ago. Closing his eyes and enjoying the breeze, the old man said that the weather today is beautiful. While the peasant walked past people with his hands behind his back, they greeted their elder with smiles on their faces. Walking along the road along the forest, the elder, who used to be an ordinary peasant, thought about the transience of time, because even the village had changed a lot. The elder stopped in the middle of the road. Looking to the side, the elder thought. The old man stopped in front of an old house, the doors and walls of which had long been overgrown with vegetation. Everything had changed over time, but not this place. Looking at the rusted doors on which moss had grown, the elder began to think about the past 37 years. The elder went to the door and looked into the courtyard of the house through the gap. A moment later, the elder's eye widened sharply. He began to run as fast as he could. The old man opened the door and burst into the wanderer's house. He began to run up to the man who was holding the hilt of his sword stuck in the ground. The elder extended his hands and opened his mouth in shock, looking at the stranger. The wanderer's hands tightly gripped the hilt of the sword. A fairly aged old man, whose body had many scars, was on his knees and holding the hilt of his sword. The elder saw the wanderer sitting with his eyes wide and not letting go of the sword. For some time he could not take his eyes off this picture. When the silvery light that surrounded the stranger went out, he laid the stranger on the ground and closed his eyes. The elder looked at the stranger with some sadness. Drops of tears fell to the ground when the elder wished the wanderer to find himself in a good place. The protagonist's blue eyes snapped open. The blue-eyed blonde began to twitch anxiously, remembering his dream. Events moved to the luxurious mansion of the Pereira family. Many people passed the entrance arch of the Pereira estate, which was a famous place of trade that connected several nearby kingdoms. A knight in silver armor with a golden outline raised his finger up and smiled, and said that the most popular here were the students of Baron Pereira. While one of the knights listened with admiration to the story of his partner, the other comrade, leaning on his spear with some dissatisfaction, looked at the narrator, who said that Princess Curlia in particular was the most famous of all, because she was only 11 years old, and she had already received the official status of a sorceress. Admiring the boy asked if the royal family had really given her the title. One of the knights looked away, trying not to listen to how his two companions admired the titles of aristocrats. The blonde knight, the ends of his hair coming out of his helmet, sighed when he heard how the newcomer admired the sorcerers and the princess. He decided to interrupt them by saying that they had an eldest son, so there was no use in fame. All three knights suddenly froze and stopped speaking upon hearing the words of their comrade. The new guy leaned back, starting to laugh as the two friends started arguing with each other over one of them's intemperate tongue. Looking at how the two knights were arguing with their faces twisted with anger, the newcomer understood the reason for their quarrel, because Princess Curlia was indeed a celebrity, but Pereira's eldest son, Iron, was much more famous for his laziness. Imagining the skinny figure of the guy, the knight involuntarily remembered his nickname, the careless aristocrat. After he lost his mother at an early age, he lay on his bed. Until his 15th birthday, he did nothing, slept for days, huddled in a blanket, for which he received such a nickname, although his mother died right before his eyes, so understand it was possible. While the two knights were constantly quarreling, the newcomer watched everything standing next to them. The girl's unexpected voice made the two knights turn around and look back. The bearded knight exclaimed in fright and began to sweat profusely. Behind them stood Curlia with her arms folded across her chest, and her mother Amelia stood next to her. Curlia frowned, asking the knights who gave them permission to make noise at their posts. The three knights abruptly stood in a row and bowed, asking for forgiveness. Hearing them, Curlia asked them in response, why would they do something for which they would have to apologize? The three knights were sweating profusely, their bodies trembling with fear, when the princess asked them how they were going to answer for their offense. Curlia glanced sharply at Amelia when she, putting her hand on her shoulder, said that she shouldn't do that. Amelia narrowed her eyes, looking at this would be enough, because they had already realized their mistake. After what was said, Curlia's mother's lips stretched into a smile, after which she asked the knights if she was right. Seeing how the knights began to worship her even more diligently, Amelia massaged her shoulders and told them to focus on serving rather than chatting. The bearded knight watched the departing members of the Pereira family. Soon all three knights looked at the backs of the departing ladies with some dissatisfaction. A moment later, all three breathed a sigh of relief. The newcomer seemed to melt with relief. Looking at the arch and the tower through which the ladies passed, the knights began to discuss the girls, calling them terrifying. One of them said that they were both strong, and therefore the future of the estate promised to be bright, unlike the prince, who was the complete opposite. Events are transferred to the protagonist's room. The bright rays of the sun illuminated his room, passing through the window. Iron jumped up from his seat, shouting. He was infuriated by his condition. His eyes and mouth were wide open, and sweat was running down his face. He could not sleep. Scratching his head, the protagonist thought. Usually at this time he slept, or rather, he slept almost the whole day. Closing one of his eyes, the sweating Iron began to remember his dream. It was as if he was in the place of that wanderer. There was a sword in his hands, and there was a salty taste in his mouth from fatigue, and the terrifying pain in his muscles was truly felt. The protagonist began to lower his trembling legs to the floor. Then he looked at his sweating and trembling palms. Iron stood up from his seat, feeling like his whole body was itching. He couldn't even stand still. The door to his chambers opened when he called the butler. A man with a thin mustache and luxuriant hair stood in the doorway, asking the prince what he wanted. Iron lowered his hands and stood numbly in front of the butler. Then the protagonist looked away. The edges of the butler's lips lifted slightly as he looked at the prince, puzzled. The protagonist raised his trembling hands and narrowed his eyes, saying that he wanted to train with the sword. The butler stood motionless and silent, not immediately understanding the meaning of his master's words. But a moment later, the butler began to sweat and his face twisted in shock, after which he asked his master what he wanted. At this time, many people gathered at the Pereira family's training ground, mostly the family's knights. A recent guard knight with a beard looked to the side in shock, asking his comrade if his eyes were deceiving him. The baron's students widened their eyes when they saw the man coming. Only the yellow-haired guy looked away. Iron slowly walked towards the training ground. The lazy prince, accompanied by his butler, went out to the training ground. The knights watched as the prince and the butler began to approach the weapon rack. Usually it was difficult for them to even see the prince's face. Seeing the protagonist walk through the training ground with the butler, many wondered if it was possible that he decided to take up fencing. Iron stopped in front of the counter, looking at the huge two-handed sword hanging on the wall. The butler standing behind him parted his lips, saying that each sword has its own characteristics depending on the size, shape, and length, and since he did not understand the art of swordsmanship, the butler asked to wait for a mentor who could help him with the choice instead of him. The butler became nervous when he heard Iron turn him down, saying he needed a mentor. The protagonist stared intently at the sword in front of him. not paying attention to other types of weapons standing nearby. Iron looked up, internally exclaiming. A moment later, he grabbed the hilt of a huge two-handed sword, saying that he would take it. One of the knights pulled the other's cheek when he asked him to do it out of disbelief to check if he was in a dream, but the knight clearly went too far in pulling the other's cheek. A moment later, the angry knight grabbed the insolent man by the hand and began to squeeze with great force, forcing his comrade to beg for mercy. Iron clenched his teeth in strain, trying to lift the huge sword. The two quarreling knights looked at the young prince in surprise. The butler involuntarily opened his mouth in surprise. Iron's hands trembled from the effort it took to lift the two-handed sword. Iron's whole body, along with the sword in her hand, was trembling, and sweat was running down the protagonist's face. The young prince tried to even out his breathing. A lot of swords hung on a stand for them. Iron raised his sword above his head and clenched his teeth with effort. The unexpected swing of the sword ended with its tip colliding with the ground. The Baron's students, standing aside, dressed in special uniforms, looked with some contempt as the protagonist again raised his weapon above his head. Both students frowned, estimating Iron's strength to be worse than ever. While Iron tried and swung his sword through clenched teeth, the two said that such a lazy prince would not succeed, although for the first time his stance was not bad. The blonde smiled as he told his friend that last month Chiron had embarrassed Iron in front of everyone. Perhaps that was the reason. Looking at the trembling prince, the student said that that time Iron did not respond at all after being humiliated. The butler, turning his head, was able to hear part of the conversation and how the two turned around and began to leave. The butler clenched his teeth. He was disgusted to hear such things about his master. The butler stood next to Iron, who was swinging his sword and, gesturing with his hands, told the prince that to master the art of the sword, daily grueling training was necessary and it would be difficult for him to cope alone. Looking at his master's back, the servant offered to find him a mentor, but he abruptly interrupted, noticing that his master was not paying attention to him. Iron began swinging his sword again, even though his body was shaking. Every time he swung, not only did his arms hurt, but all his muscles hurt. He swung his sword, not understanding why he did it. Iron changed the position of his legs for greater comfort. The next swing of the sword was the last. The young prince began to fall exhausted to the ground. Iron tried to catch his breath. He took deep breaths and exhalations while lying on the ground. He lay on the ground, but instead of feeling pain and fatigue, he felt relief and calm. The protagonist began to stand up. He grabbed the hilt of his sword with one hand and rose to one knee, repeating over and over again what he had seen in his dream. The movements of that wanderer, he began to feel the heaviness in his chest weakening. Every time he swung his sword, his hated memories disappeared. Each swing evaporated the burden of responsibility that lay on his shoulders. Once again, the protagonist raised a huge sword above his head, unable to stop. Drops of sweat flew up due to the sharpness in the protagonist's movements. Suddenly the butler intervened and stopped his master. The worried butler began to shout, asking Iron to stop because it was already getting dark. Looking at the butler, Iron incredulously asked him if it was really getting dark. A moment later, without finishing, Iron began to fall, but the butler caught the prince. Holding the prince, the butler asked about his well-being, to which he responded by saying that he had no more strength. Iron raised his head a little, wondering how he could do this, hearing his butler say that the prince was too overzealous. The sun was already setting. The buildings of the estate turned black, ceasing to be illuminated. Iron wondered how time could pass so quickly. When the butler threw Iron's hand over his shoulder, the prince asked him if he was standing here and waiting for him, why he didn't go about his business or call him earlier. The butler answered the prince, saying that he wouldn't dare to leave his master and go somewhere else. Then, besides, he did not react to his words. When the profusely sweating Iron was able to walk on his own, the butler said that he would order everything to be cleaned up here, and it was time for him to rest, because training, although it was a good thing, was impossible to overexert. Upon hearing him, Iron parted his lips, saying that he was unlikely to do this again. At night in the Pereira estate, the light was still on in Iron's room. The young prince held his hand and screamed, complaining about the pain in his muscles and about himself, while cursing the dream he had. Trembling all over and holding his hand, Iron said that now he would certainly not be able to sleep. But 5 minutes later, the young prince fell asleep like a baby, even drool flowing from his mouth. Events moved forward a few days to the kitchen of the Pereira estate. Iron was taking a bite of his sandwich at this time. Taking huge bites, Iron did not stop letting go of the glass of milk in his hand. A moment later, the protagonist washed down everything he had eaten with milk. The butler standing behind the prince looked at him in shock. No matter how much he looked, he couldn't get used to it. But he still decided to ask the young prince if he would go to train. After he asked this, the prince, without looking up from his absorption food, answered him with consent. While Iron devoured everything edible on the table, sitting on a luxurious chair, he thought about the fact that from that day on, an incomprehensible dream continued to haunt him, and in order to get rid of the itching in his body, he continued to train. Iron stopped eating and thought a little sadly about the fact that when he swung his sword, no unnecessary thoughts arose in his head, and doing something useful was not the worst outcome. Iron sharply slammed his glass on the table and ordered him to bring him more milk and sandwiches. Near the entrance arch to the training ground, people were discussing Iron's arrival today. 3 knights crowded together, debating who would win their dispute. The newcomer abruptly interrupted and looked to the side. His friend asked him, puzzled, what was the matter? But suddenly the old man's voice interrupted him. He asked for forgiveness, asking to show him the way. An old man in a red robe with a long and lush gray beard smiled, asking for directions to the training ground. The bearded knight asked who the old man was. Since he was heading there, he waved his hand and introduced himself as a knight-errant, and as a swordsman, he wanted to visit this estate and at the same time look at the site. The knights began to look at each other when the old man said that he had permission. Then all 3 looked at the old man, and the bearded knight said that he would need to wait a little until their shift was over, and then they would take him to the site because they were also going there. Approaching the red gates of the training ground, the knights began to look forward to the moment when they would find out the winner of their dispute. Suddenly, the bearded knight widened his eyes when he saw Iron. He saw how he continued to raise his sword, trembling with his whole body. This shocked everyone who came. The bearded knight sighed when he saw the joyful face of his partner, with whom he argued and ultimately lost. He threw the bag of money directly into the palm of his partner, not forgetting to curse him, but he did not express anything in gratitude. Looking at the gold coin in his hand, the satisfied knight said that the son of Viscount Chiron had disgraced the prince very much. Perhaps his persistence would be enough for a week. An old man in a red robe stood next to the knights and watched as 2 of them began to quarrel again. Then the old man turned, looking at the prince. Looking at how he raised the sword above his head, the old man mentally said to himself that he was definitely not wasting his time and was not that bad. However, looking at his trembling hands, the old man could not help but notice the low level of skill. He was so weak that he could barely hold the sword. Seeing how Iron was sweating and trying to catch his breath, the errant knight decided that he also lacked stamina. Standing motionless and looking at the young prince, the old man wondered how long Iron would last, hearing that the reason was revenge. The old man thought, because it was impossible to approach the art of the sword lightly with such obscene intentions. Seeing a small gust of wind passing across the ground, the old man began to think. All the knights and the old man raised their heads, seeing how the wind began to rise. The bearded knight opened his mouth in shock, not believing what he saw. Iron, concentrated on his training, did not pay enough attention and only looked up. Curlia, riding a griffin, flew to the training ground. Everyone saw their mistress Curlia riding a griffin, her long and luscious braided hair flowing in the wind as she looked down with some displeasure. The griffin was a mythical creature, a creature from legends that does not exist in reality. The body was that of a lion, and the wings of an eagle. Like the head, the skin was as strong as steel. The knights opened their mouths in shock and fear. Curlia sank to the ground, kicking up a small amount of dust under her foot. The griffin, with its landing, raised a huge amount of dust and broke the tiles in some places. Curlia petted the griffin, an animal she created with her own hands, and then infused energy into it, making it alive. Such was the ability of Curlia Pereira. For figures of knights were displayed in the griffin's eye. Curlia shouted and pointed her finger at the knight. The newcomer, seeing that she was pointing at him, got scared and shuddered with his whole body, almost starting to cry. Curlia then frowned and looked in the other direction. A moment later she repeated her action, and again looked in the other direction. When the princess chose him, the knight shuddered in fear and began to tremble. Next she chose the bearded knight, frightening him and forcing him to open his mouth wide. When it was the old man's turn, he smiled and waved. introducing himself as a knight-errant who had come to see the training ground. The 3 knights lined up in a row when the princess, pointing at them, asked them if they were the ones she met yesterday and why they were now here during working hours. The frightened knights tried to explain in a trembling voice, saying that they had just finished their shift. The bearded knight, smiling nervously, said that other people were already on shift and they were not doing anything forbidden. The griffin turned its head towards the knight when Curlia noticed that the knights were just talking instead of training. The princess suddenly stopped screaming when the young prince called her. Iron approached and asked what was the reason for her scolding. Curlia turned away without saying a word. Then the princess looked at her brother and parted her lips, trying to say something. But she looked away again, unable to say anything. Looking at the newcomer, the princess turned to her brother, telling him to stop doing useless nonsense. The prince looked at his sister blankly, saying nothing. A moment later, Iron simply turned around and, closing his eyes, began to walk away. This shocked Curlia and the griffin. Curlia frowned at her brother. Iron, not paying attention to his sister, raised his sword again. Curlia could not stand it and screamed, accusing her brother of being frivolous, because he, not understanding the art of the sword, decided to start training, although all he had done before was sleep. The younger sister shouted at her brother, who was standing in front. She asked him if he decided that if he practiced with the sword, something would change. Pointing at the newcomer, the princess shouted and said that even he was many times better than him. The griffin raised his head listening to Curlia asking Iron not to say that everything he started was happening only because of what he was told 2 weeks ago. Amelia suddenly appeared and made everyone look at her. The smiling mother asked her daughter not to disturb her brother and come to her. Curlia, seeing her mother, began to be indignant, clenching her hand into a fist, but her mother demanded to come to her. Bowing her head, the princess no longer became indignant. The knights flanked Amelia as she wished them good work. Amelia smilingly asked Iron not to overdo it. Iron looked at his father's wife and promised her this. Then the mother and daughter began to leave. The knights sighed with relief after they left, closing their eyes. But the griffin's cry frightened them again, forcing them to scream. The old man closed his eyes and smiled. Realizing that it was the same Curlia Pereira that he had heard rumors about, she was like a blast wave that suddenly surged as she passed by. The old man opened his eyes, noticing something about Iron. Looking at the back of the one who again took the blade in his hands and did not lose concentration for a second, the old man standing in a red robe decided to watch the prince standing in front for a few days. Night soon fell. The corridors of the Pereira estate were illuminated by dim moonlight coming through the windows. A girl in pink slippers and pants walked along the corridor. The unexpected appearance of Marcus frightened the princess. The butler notified the princess that the prince was sleeping. Curlia looked at Marcus, saying that she had business with him, but the butler objected, advising him to come tomorrow. The princess changed the position of her legs and turned around. The enraged Curlia released a huge amount of mana from her body, frightening Marcus, and then asked him how he dared to dare her. The butler clenched his teeth, feeling the enormous pressure. A moment later, Marcus fell to his knees, and the pressure exuding from the girl disappeared. The enraged girl, holding something covered with a blanket in her hand, ordered Mark not to tell anyone about what had happened. Marcus, kneeling on one knee, looked at his young mistress with some fear. Drops of sweat ran down the butler's face as he looked at the back of the leaving girl. When morning came, the beast created with the help of magic was playing the flute. The music began to spread throughout the bedroom of Iron, who was sleeping on the bed. The prince opened his eyes when he heard a pleasant melody. Sitting down on the bed, Iron looked at the half-dead cat playing a melody. There was a letter next to the cat's leg. Having opened the letter, the prince began to take out a note from it. The prince's lips stretched into a smile while he read the note. It was a note from Curlia asking for forgiveness for not saying this during the day, but having learned that he hardly eats and overworks himself, she was very worried. The doll bowed when Iron looked at it. The letter indicated that his sister gave him this doll in the hope that it would help him relax, and in the letter his sister asked not to say anything to his mother because she asked not to bother him. Turning the note over, Iron noticed the words written on the back of his mother asking him to tell him if Curlia bothers him, and until now she will pretend that she doesn't know anything. Stroking the cat on the head, Iron looked at the letter in his hand. He was pleased that his mother and Curlia were worried and cared for him, although he had just been lying in bed like a non-entity for more than 10 years. The butler's voice announcing breakfast forced Iron to take the blanket and leave the cat and the note in the room. Rising from the bed, the prince looked down. Walking down the corridor, the young prince did not believe that he would eat with his family today. Marcus quickened his pace as he followed his master. A smile stretched across his face seeing how Iron had changed. Curlia offered the steak to her brother, telling him to take more. The father smiled seeing how his daughter demanded that her brother take everything that was on the table. The prince became a little depressed and lowered his gaze. All three family members glanced at Iron as he thanked them for their kindness despite him doing nothing but laying around in bed. Amelia smiled as she listened to Iron thank her. Curlia opened his eyes wide in surprise as he listened to his brother. The father smiled as he heard his son confess his weakness and express his love for them. He told him that he also loved him very much, like everyone else in the room. Father Iron closed his eyes, saying not to say that anymore and to go back to eating. When all the plates on the table were empty, the father turned to his son. Iron listened as his father told him that he had heard that he had been focusing his attention on fencing lately. The body training was not bad, although a little late for him, but he couldn't overdo it. Iron turned his head and said that everything was fine and he was no longer overworked. His father advised him to take short breaks from his studies, but Iron actually did not listen to his father because compared to the training that he saw in his dream, his training was nothing. Clouds moved smoothly across the blue sky. The blonde and his friend looked at Iron in his training. Then the blonde asked his friend what day it was today, to which he replied by saying that about a crescent had already passed. Iron's blade almost touched the ground after swinging his sword, while the prince, whose body trembled with every movement, continued to try and train. People discussed him saying that he would soon reach his limit. Next, two friends looked at the old man in a red robe. The blonde inquired about his identity. His comrade looked at the old man sitting and said that it was the beholder who had written "Wake Up." The old man held a blade of grass in his mouth and, with his eyes closed, listened to the conversation of the young guys. He opened his eyes and looked at the guy standing in front of him. It was the 10th day of his observation of the prince's training. At first he reasoned that his motivation for learning sword art was only an inferiority complex and pride. Stroking his beard, the old man closed his eyes again. His previous judgments turned out to be wrong. Lowering his hand, the old man continued to look at Iron's training, thinking about what he heard about the careless aristocrat. Then he heard that this nickname was given to him because of how lazy he is, but as a person who has never exercised in his life, continues training tirelessly without a single dislike on his face. Opening one eye slightly, the old man thought, Iron spent day after day with the mood of a blacksmith forging iron, without hesitation, as if he had lived at this pace for decades. The stranger could not help but frown, because after looking all his life, he could not remember anyone with such a will. But a moment later he looked again at the back of the prince holding a sword in front of him. The old man said to himself that no matter how great the hero was, no matter how terrifying his will was, it accumulated at a fairly mature age, and in front of him was a boy of 15 years old, and if he continues to study fencing and discovers his potential as an apprentice under a good teacher, he can reach terrifying heights. Looking at the protagonist's face, from which sweat was dripping, this is exactly what the old man thought about. Iron, not paying attention to the crowded people on the side, continued his training and swung his sword. The old man in the red robe folded his hands on his knees as he watched the prince train. With a smile on his face, the old man turned to the guard. Looking again at the sweating prince, around whom a haze of steam had already formed, the old man asked if he had a teacher. The wandering swordsman stood up listening to the guard tell him that the owner of the estate had just recently said that he would soon assign a fencing master to the prince, because he could not abandon such efforts of his son. Stroking his beard, the guard said that Orn Zuckran would most likely become the prince's teacher. Suddenly, the knight-errant screamed, startling the guard. The old man protested about Zuckran's role as a teacher. The old man remembered Zuckran, a man who, the day before regular training, drank buckets of alcohol and then yelled at the soldiers. He could not entrust such a precious child to him. After all, out of nowhere he could begin to destroy everything and frighten the knights. Frowning, the old man walked towards the exit. He couldn't let anyone ruin the boy's talent. Drops of sweat were running down the old man's face. He decided to meet with the owner of the estate as soon as possible. Events are transferred to the office of the owner of the estate. Standing in front of the Baron, the old man in a red robe told him about everything, greatly surprising Father Ire. The Baron glanced at the old man, mentally wondering about his son's talent. A moment later, he lowered his gaze, looking down. He looked at the entrance recommendation for the Chrono Fencing Academy and thought about it. It was the best academy on the entire continent. The academy was huge, and the symbol of the academy was hands holding a sword. They selected only talented children. Regardless of gender, nationality, and status, people of different ages and nations who graduated from there held their swords like true masters. It was enough to become its official student for a person to be treated much more respectfully. Baron Pereira looked at the letter in his hands and wondered. Chrono's greatness was commensurate with the level of difficulty of getting in, and getting out was a piece of cake. It made him wonder if Iron could handle it. When Iron went into his father's office and listened to everything, his mouth opened in shock. The father smiled and extended his hand, saying that he would not insist, and if he did not want to, he could simply say. The young prince, sweat still dripping down his face, listened as his father said that he was only telling him about one of the paths. The choice was always his. After Iron asked for time to think, he sat motionless in his room on the bed and thought. Looking at the floor, the prince wondered if he could. The prince's lips parted as he thought about the fact that he had been just lying in bed for 10 years. The protagonist gripped the edge of the bed. Having made a decision, he wasn't going to be like this all the time. Looking at the clear sky, he decided to change for his own sake, for the sake of his family, who loves him very much. Iron went into his father's office and called out to him. A moment later, the prince shouted that he was going to Chrono Academy. Soon, Marcus and Iron said goodbye standing near the carriage, and his family stood near the entrance to the Pereira estate. Emilia wiped away her tears, and Curlia folded her arms across her chest and wished her luck. Iron and Marcus were riding in a carriage heading to Chrono Academy. Marcus smiled when he saw how Iron kept looking out the window, and then asked if this was the first time his master went outside the estate. The butler handed over a necklace with a sword as a decoration to Iron, saying that Curlia asked him to give it to him. The protagonist widened his eyes when he saw his sister's gift. A moment later, Iron had already put on the necklace and, squeezing it in his hand, thanked his little sister. After some time had passed, Marcus and Iron dismounted from the carriage, the protagonist looking at the building in front of him with admiration while Marcus announced that they had arrived. A crowd of people entered the huge gates of an equally majestic building. Marcus glanced at his master, telling him that he would escort him to the entrance. The butler turned sharply and looked at his master after he said that he would go himself. Iron looked at his hands, saying that from now on he was a student and he needed to get used to acting alone. Tears appeared in Marcus's eyes, and his lips stretched into a smile as he looked at his master. The protagonist began to turn around and, with a final glance at the butler, said goodbye to him. Marcus bowed after his master, wishing him to achieve brilliant results. Soon the turn came to the man standing in front of the protagonist, accompanied by 2 knights. One of the knights standing next to the blue-haired guy held out a scroll, saying that this was Prince Brad from the Count family, Brad of the Kingdom of Cobra, and he received a recommendation from a knight with a high reputation named Call Shady. 2 knights standing at the gate greeted Brad and asked her to come quickly. Men with red hair in which there were several strands of gray hair looked at the protagonist. Iron handed out a letter of recommendation, saying that his name was Iron Pereira, originally from the baronial Pereira family, and he received the letter of recommendation from the knight-errant Brand Somerville. The green-haired knight spread his arms to the sides and, smiling along with his partner, said that it was an honor for them to meet him. Remembering the battle of the knight Brand Somerville with a huge monster, the knight said that they also knew him, because it was the great gentleman who led the raid in the mines for several decades. Iron walked through the gate and thanked the knights for their support. The red-haired knight and his partner looked after the departing Iron, perplexed as old man Brand wrote a letter of recommendation. His partner, recognizing the careless aristocrat, thought about the reason for this even more. Looking in the back, green-haired Iron began to explain to his partner that he was a careless aristocrat, a lazy person of the Pereira family, a man who seemed weaker to him up close than by rumors. How could he force Brand to write a letter? The red-haired knight involuntarily opened his mouth looking at Iron. Soon Iron reached the door and touched it with his hand. He made a little effort to open it. All the people in the hall began to turn their heads to look at the newcomer. Everyone stared at Iron in shock after learning his identity. Brad and his friend looked at Iron with contempt. Everyone stared at him. He tried to maintain his composure when he saw the red-haired girl looking at him with contempt. Seeing another disdainful look from the girl with snow-white hair, the protagonist repeated to himself not to lose his composure. Seeing a familiar person approaching the speaker's place, Iron was surprised by this. Standing in the middle of the stage, the man began to introduce himself. It turned out that he was the instructor, the one who would train and evaluate all 400 students. Amed looked down and frowned a little. The first he noticed was Brad, a boy with blue hair and a smile on his face. Next he looked at Judith, a serious girl with red hair. And the last person he paid attention to was Ilya, a girl with white hair and a distant look. Among them all, Ilya stood out, being the second genius of the Lynch sword family. Brad frowned when he saw Ilya in the front row of students. He wondered what she was doing here. Brad clenched his teeth, realizing that because of her he would have no chance of taking first place. Amed extended his hand and started shouting. He warned everyone that they were not students yet, but were only pre-selection students. The children, including Iron, stood motionless listening to the conditions of the instructor. He demanded that they endure 2 tough tests, and a year later also be present at this place. Only then could they become students, however. After officially joining the Chrono Academy, real hell awaited them. Amed smiled broadly, demanding that he leave all his things here and go out. Soon all the students and Amed found themselves in a huge stadium with a treadmill, putting his hands on his hips as he walked past the students. Amed said this would be a physical training session where they would develop their heart, lung, and muscle endurance, and the uneven path surrounding the area was their usual running route. Amed was silent as he approached the treadmill. Amed suddenly started running and shouted to run after him because the test had begun. Looking at the students who were barely keeping up with him, Amed grinned, deciding to increase his speed a little. The instructor was able to break away from the group of students running behind him, praising them, the same ones raising huge clouds of dust behind them. Iron, who was running almost at the very end, was already sweating heavily and was trying to catch his breath, while the others gritted their teeth, trying to keep up with the instructor. Brad, who was running almost at the very beginning, clenched his teeth, feeling that the race promised to be long. Smiling, Brad decided to look at the careless aristocrat. It turned out that the Iron had already fallen off his feet and was shaking all over, trying not to fall completely. The protagonist's eyes were wide open. He felt his heart barely holding on, wanting to explode. It was too hard for him. Amed, who had run half the circle, looked at Iron. Although the instructor was a little disappointed, he didn't say anything and continued running. Iron looked forward at the figures of gradually moving away people. Trembling all over, he began to crawl, unable to take even a step. Suddenly the young prince was able to get up and ran again. Brad was shocked to see this. He even stopped smiling. The protagonist stood up and began to run, drops of sweat flying from his face. Ames saw this and smiled broadly. The protagonist again remembered his dream, that wanderer, in comparison with which what he went through was nothing. Using all his strength, shedding sweat and tears, the protagonist ran with all his strength. He wanted to be like the wanderer from his dream. He wanted to be equal to him. Iron's eye opened wide. He was ready to run away from his lazy self for this. Iron, proudly raising his head, ran using forces that had long since ended. The green-haired guy, watching the protagonist, mentally stated that he was surprised why the protagonist had not yet given up. He was instantly surprised when he noticed Iron's movements as he ran after the crowd. Looking at the unusual movements and facial expressions of the running guy, he thought that something was wrong here. Covered with sweat and dirty clothes, Iron, barely keeping his balance, continued to run. The crowd running behind him captured the moment of his fall. A second before the unconscious fall of the main character, a green-haired guy caught him. He leaned over as other people passed him. Having laid the protagonist on the ground and exhaled, he mentally stated that the guy clearly fell not from simple overwork, but from complete exhaustion. He squeezed out all the strength he could muster. The face of the lying protagonist turned blue. He tried to take in air. He continued to lie with his eyes closed. Suddenly he opened them. Rising slightly from the bed, he looked around and thought about where he was. Looking back at the phrase about his awakening, the protagonist turned to the right. Holding one hand on his belt, a man with dark hair tied in a ponytail said that the guy need not worry about his health because he was in perfect order. He introduced himself as Lung, an instructor, and also the head of the rehabilitation department. Looking down, the protagonist thanked the guy. Yawning, Lung proudly declared that if it weren't for him, the guy wouldn't have recovered like that. Looking into the face of the main character, the man said that he thought that they would see each other often. Looking at the slightly embarrassed guy, he said that he was joking and asked the guy not to answer with such a serious face. He handed him the scroll and told him to take it. Opening it, Iron began to read. Lung said that this was the student's ranking based on the results of the first test, and said not to worry about it. After all, the intermediate assessment, unlike the final assessment, does not greatly affect official admission to the academy. The first test was needed only to approximately determine the level of endurance of the pre-recruitment students. The protagonist was shocked when he saw his name on the lowest line. For 100th, placing his hands on his feet, the man said that the higher the place, the happier the soul, but the lower, the stronger the incentive to try harder. Opening his eyes, Lung said that this rating in a year will change beyond recognition. The thought flashed through the man's head that although he wanted to cheer him up, he didn't look like someone who needed it. Looking at the guy looking slightly upset at the rolled-up scroll, he noted that the rumors about his eccentricity did not lie. Taking the protagonist out of bed and starting to push him forward by the shoulders, the man said with a smile that it was impossible to skip classes on the first day. The green-haired guy standing at the table greeted all the pre-selection students. He also asked if they slept well in their new place. Hundreds of people sitting in a large auditorium confirmed. Holding his hands on the table, the man, closing his eyes, said that this is very good, and he sees that they are cheerful today, and this is wonderful. He introduced himself as Karaka, one of the instructors who is responsible for their training. Making a hand gesture to show them their schedule, he said that from now on, their day would proceed according to this schedule. From 6 to 8, waking up and breakfast. From 8 to 12, training. From 12 to 13, lunch. From 13 to 17, training. From 17 to 18, dinner. From 18 to 19, mental training and general education lessons. He also noted that if something changes, they will report it. The students listened carefully to the teacher. He also said that after 7 in the evening there is free time. From this day on, they have access to all outdoor areas, the indoor gym and other training areas available at the academy. Anyone can use them in their free time as self-study. Looking down with a smile, the main character mentally stated that today he could finally pick up a sword again. Giving a thumbs up, he noted that training with weapons is prohibited. The protagonist looked in shock at the teacher, who made his statement with a smile. A dark, cloudy night stood over a building with 4 rooms with lights. A team of academy students approached the door of the building. One of the walking guys asked the blue-haired guy if he found ordinary lessons boring. Raising his hand slightly, he said that he almost fell asleep listening to the theory. Rad walked forward. The guy with green hair grinned and said that they were just saying a bunch of words, the meaning of which he didn't know. Looking angrily at the guy, he said that he should shut up because he understood him perfectly. Entering the building, a group of guys looked around the spacious room in surprise. It was a gym in which a considerable number of people trained. Looking around the hall, one of the guys said that many plowed already on the first day. Another noted that he thought their passion would wane in a couple of weeks. Brad looked away in surprise. Someone was lifting a barbell with a lot of weights. A white-haired girl with a pumped-up back, holding a barbell on her shoulders, squatted with it. There was a look of concentration on her face as she made her approach. The guy looked at Elijah in surprise. He thought that the rumors about her were, on the contrary, downplayed. As soon as you look at her, you immediately feel the pressure. An image of Brad appeared, standing on a hill and looking up. He mentally declared that the other students were no match for her. He also mentally noted that standing next to him, you begin to feel inferior. An image appeared of a guy looking at a girl who was on a higher island with a ladder, beyond which there was an abyss. He mentally stated that they were on completely different levels. One of the guys amazed by the girl asked where she got such a physique, because she is a year younger than him. Looking at the protagonist doing a bench press with an empty bar, the 2 guys said that even their careless aristocrat had taken up self-discipline. Laughing loudly, one of the guys said that he really worked hard during the last test. He also stated that people do change. The second guy said that this was absurd, because it should have started a long time ago. He also asked why he had been idle for so many years. The protagonist lifted the bar with all his might. The guys looking at him, laughing, They also said that it seemed like he would soon lose consciousness again. Finishing her approach, the white-haired girl silently wiped sweat from her forehead and looked at the guys. Brad, after passing through his friends, said that they had no reason to waste time and had to go. The blue-haired guy looked back at the red-haired girl. Looking at how diligently she made the approach, he mentally said that she was a commoner named Judith, but she was able to displace him from the second position in the ranking. He also mentally noted that she seemed to have to work hard to get into the academy. He looked at the tired girl. Assessing her with a cold gaze, he mentally said that he would no longer allow someone like her to steal his place. He flexed his fists and looked angrily at Judith. Turning around sharply, she told him to stop staring. Looking at the girl incomprehensibly, he asked if she was talking to him. Looking at him angrily, she asked if he was blind, for she was looking straight into his eyes. She told him to leave because he was disturbing her concentration. The guy's friends ran up and began to aggressively ask what she said to him, because in front of her was a noble lord from the Earl family of Lloyd. They shouted that such a non-entity like her was not allowed to behave rudely with him. The girl asked who they were. Were they his regular girlfriends? Running even closer, the green-haired guy told her to get on her knees and ask for his forgiveness. Holding a dumbbell in her hand, she said with disgust that his breath stank and asked if they really ate the same food. Turning to her left, Judith told him to be quiet for 5 seconds. The guy looked at the red-haired girl in disbelief. He looked back in the direction she was looking. In an instant, the second and third places in the ranking were staring at one side of the room. Ilya approached the stubbornly approaching protagonist. She apologized with an interested face and asked if he could listen to her. Placing the bar on his chest, Iron looked blankly at the blonde girl. Judith watched their conversation. They looked at each other silently. Bending over a little, the girl pointed her finger at his body and said something to him. Several people watched their actions in surprise. Having finished her conversation, the girl calmly went out, and the guy, smiling slightly, sat on the bench for exercise. Holding her hands clenched into fists, the girl moved away from him. She opened the door. With a loud clap, she left the gym. The main character silently looked at the door. After a moment, he looked back to the right. The people standing nearby quickly turned away and began to do their exercises. Brad and Judith, looking at the protagonist, mentally said that they had not heard anything. The red-haired girl put a dumbbell in the hands of the green-haired guy and walked towards Iron with a fallen look. Exhaling after each repetition, the main character did a bench press with a concentrated look. Judith called him uncivilly. He turned in her direction in surprise. Approaching the guy who was pestering him, the girl asked if he was ignoring him and stated that he had to answer when called. The protagonist apologized and asked what she wanted. Looking coldly at the main character, the girl said that there was nothing from him. She also told him to tell everything quickly. Surprised, Iron asked what exactly. Moving closer to his face, Judith asked what he was talking about with Elijah. Judith was very surprised by the protagonist's answer. Placing her hands on her belt, she asked incredulously if he thought he could deceive her like that. The girl also claimed that Ilya only explained to him how to bench press a barbell correctly. Raising his hand, the guy uncertainly declared that he was not lying. Looking at the main character incredulously, the judoite asked if they knew each other before or maybe they had met. The protagonist replied that they met for the first time today. Sighing and turning around, the girl went back. She finally told him to make his face simpler, otherwise it would feel like he was being bullied. Looking at her, the protagonist mentally asked why she pestered him. Raising the bar above his head, he mentally declared that it was time for him to practice and that he shouldn't think about it. Tired as he began his approach, he thought about what he needed to do right. Brad approached the guy and asked what he was talking about with Ilya and the red-haired girl. He stated that he became very curious and decided to ask. A month later, the blue-haired guy drank water. An acquaintance of his lying on the floor of the hall said that they had had the same daily routine for a whole month. He asked if they thought it was unfair that they were not given swords. Brad looked away seriously. Looking at the protagonist doing squats with a barbell, the white-haired girl, intently watching his workout, told him not to arch his lower back. Placing her hands together, looking at the guy's great efforts, she told him to breathe more evenly. Stretching his hands, Brad slightly closing his eyes, mentally said that there was no point in paying attention to these two. Looking at Ilya, who was actively giving advice to the main character, He thought that in fact he would never surpass her, and she would take first place in the ranking this time too. Looking at Iron, whose face was sweating from the difficulty of squatting with a barbell, the guy said that he was exactly the opposite. The guy mentally noted that he was sure that someone had pushed him here. An image appeared of a guy running. Brad wondered if a guy who had never tried hard in his life could beat him by suddenly going all out in training. The blue-haired guy mentally noted that the protagonist does not give up only because Ilya supports him, and the ridicule of others serves as his motivation. An image of the protagonist falling into an imaginary abyss appeared. The guy said that when he gets used to everything, he will return to his former self, to a careless aristocrat. Turning around, Brad told his team members to go to the stadium. The thought flashed through his head that his goal was second place. As he left the building, he looked forward with displeasure. Judith was running as hard as she could. Looking at her efforts, one of the blue-haired friends said that she was tough because every day she comes here before them. The second replied that this was obvious because a commoner needs to plow to survive. Brad gritted his teeth slightly and pursed his lip. Walking forward, the guy told his friends that they were already starting to run. Looking in front, the guy said that they should drag behind if they were tired. Turning around, he said with coldness and confidence in his voice that if they were capable of more, they should squeeze out every last drop of strength from themselves and catch up with him. 3 months later, several people entered the crowded gym. 2 teachers who entered the hall with smiles said that although many were already exhausted, this year there were worthwhile personnel. Judith was jumping on the table, Brad was running, and Elijah was doing bench press. One of the teachers noted that their outstanding trinity still adheres to self-discipline. Karaka, turning towards the protagonist, said that he was careless. He continued to look at the guy and interrupted himself with a smile. Looking at the main character, who was lifting dumbbells on the bench, he said that he could no longer be called careless. The teacher at Dudoroya, holding his hands behind his back, said that they had an announcement. The main character, along with the rest of the students, looked carefully at the man. He said that the midterm assessment was approaching. The teacher clapped his hands. Making a hand gesture, he talked about the map behind him. He said that this was the route they would have to run. He said all they had to do was run it in a limited time. Several students looked at the map in surprise and fear, saying that it was impossible to run this distance in such a time. Placing his hands together, Ames stated that they had been learning to run and swim for 4 months, and it would be a very simple task for them. The evaluation system is simple. It doesn't matter what place you take. The main thing is to meet the deadline. Brad listened to the teacher in slight surprise. Ames also noted that the first 5 who cross the finish line will be personally presented with awards by the head of the academy. He asked the disciples if this was not a good reward. The teacher with a scar on his face, smiling, expressively said that the exam would take place in 10 days at 9 in the morning. Until then, classes will be cancelled. Students can use all the time as they wish, but they must not forget about food. At the end of his speech, the man wished everyone good luck. Raising his hand, one of the blue-haired man's friends asked if he could handle it. The green-haired man shouted to him that naturally Brad could handle it, because he was much better than the guy. Looking ahead confidently, Bra thought that even though there were opponents such as Elijah and Judith, as well as several other people, even in the worst-case scenario, nothing would prevent him from entering the top 5. Turning and looking coldly to the side, the thought ran through the guy's head about why his attention always switches to the protagonist trained hard by running in circles. The morning sun illuminated the small castle. In the gym, the girl finished her approach, exhaled, and put down the barbell. Clenching both hands into fists, Judith said with a smile that this was her new record and she could finish it for today. She turned around at the unusual sounds. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. She looked at the protagonist, who was kneeling and actively breathing after approaching. The wet guy stood up, wiping sweat from his face. The girl noted that he had again pushed himself to the limit. His physical indicators have improved significantly compared to those at the time of admission. Without giving himself a rest, the main character began to squat with a barbell again. The red-haired girl mentally asked herself how he could push so much out of himself. She clenched her fist. She mentally asked herself if her will was really weaker than the will of a careless aristocrat. Taking the barbell in her hands, she began to lift it onto her triceps with great persistence. He mentally declared that this would not happen. Karaka, with his hands on his waist and a smile on his face, asked another teacher how many people he thought would pass this year. Holding his hands folded, the man guessed there were about 30 people. An old man with a gray beard, approaching the teachers, said that he was generous with his assessment. Looking at the man, Aim asked the manager what he was doing here. With a smile on his face, Chrono, the head of the academy, said that he had decided not to repeat last year's mistakes and wanted to see everything with his own eyes, rather than listen to other people's stories. Shaking the green-haired instructor's hand, he asked if he was the same newcomer from the kingdom of Adam. Welcoming the leader with a smile, the instructor confirmed his statement and noted that their meeting was an honor for him. Squinting his eyes slightly, Chrono asked how old he looked. Smiling uncertainly and stuttering slightly, Karaka said about 55. Joyfully tugging the guy by the neck, the 90-year-old manager laughed and said that he couldn't stand open sycophancy, and also noted that now the guy could expect a double salary. The instructor thanked him. Aimed, looking at them with disbelief, mentally declared that the guy should not believe him because it was not he who was calculating the salary. Looking around the gym, Chrono noted that the atmosphere here is not the same as last year. He also asked if this was all the result of good teaching. Karaka said that the leader overpraises them. Looking at the students, Chrono thought. The green-haired guy, turning towards the man, tried to understand what he was thinking about. He, looking at Ilya, noted that this same girl was the second nugget of the Lynch family of swordsmen. An image of a white-haired girl appeared, lifting a barbell while standing. The instructor said that she was incredibly smart and talented, as befits her family members. Until now, she took first place in all subjects. The leader, looking at the girl, said that it would be better for her to choose her own path than to cling to what others have chosen. He also noted that she was a poor child. He asked if this was really how the world works, and expressed hope that the day would come when she would get rid of these attachments. Judith stubbornly squatted the barbell. The manager asked if he was talking about the same girl last time. Karaka confirmed. Sweat ran down the red-haired girl's face as she tried her best to complete the approach. Chrono asked if they tried to stop her because she was clearly overloading herself. Slightly closing his eyes, the instructor replied that of course they tried, but she didn't want to listen. He noted that perhaps she could be considered the most persistent in this assessment. Moving from the spot, Chrono said that it was still worth stopping her because it would be a great pity if such a talent ruined itself. He noted that she probably had a reason why she was trying so hard. He said he would try to talk to her. The leader approached the girl, who threw the barbell, finishing her approach. Seeing this, Karaka asked Aimed if he thought he had a chance to convince her. The instructor replied that of course, because he could not disobey the leader. He shouted in surprise when he saw Chrono walking away from the girl, who started a new approach. A man who approached Aimed, laughing slightly, said that she was a very stubborn child. He also noted that she said she would stop if she heard a good reason. Looking at the instructor with a smile, the leader asked where Iron was now. An image of dumbbells of different weights lying down appeared. Aimed, slightly tilting his head, looking at the protagonist, asked how much time had passed. Karaka replied that he had been standing there for 30 minutes. The main character was squatting with a barbell. Turning around, the leader walked in the other direction. Looking forward, he said to leave it. Turning to the instructors, the man said not to stop him for anything, and to stop him only if he himself gives up. He looked at the guys in human efforts. The leader said that his mind now dominates his body. The protagonist fell onto the bed. He exhaled, putting his hand to his chest. Looking at his palm, he mentally stated that a lot of unusual things had happened in recent days. Remembering the faces of Judith and Brad, he mentally said that the guys who ignored and mocked him began to pay attention to him. Remembering the blonde girl, he asked himself why she was helping him. He noted that she was not one of those who would do something out of sympathy. Putting his fist on his head, he thought that he should stop thinking. An image of red cloth appeared. A woman, wrapped in a red robe, held the sleepy protagonist, who thought that he already knew this place. He mentally noted that they had not seen each other for a long time. Being in the arms of a huge girl, he mentally said that he had not left his bed in order to be here. Continuing to lie in her arms, he thought that although this was not his mother's hug, it was still very warm. Holding the girl by her clothes, he mentally stated that falling asleep would be very useful. White light illuminated the main character and the girl. A huge flow of energy covered the entire room. A pumped-up man without any outerwear put his two-handed sword forward. Iron looked at him in surprise. The girl grabbed his hand. He looked around in her direction, confused. He calmly placed his hand on hers. With a soft smile, he thanked the girl for everything. Turning around, he walked away, declaring that it was now time for him to go. Smoke came from the protagonist lying on the bed. He stood up when all parts of his body were covered with it. The guy walked along a sandy path surrounded by forests. Several students turned in his direction and noted that he had no clothes and suggested that he had probably been up all night. A friend of the blue-haired guy said that he was infuriating and that not everyone would be evaluated individually. He stated that he would have definitely screwed up that way. Turning towards the unrecovered Judith, Brad mentally noted that she had been very overworked for the last few days and her condition was beyond envy. He looked at her with a victorious smile. He thought that if he didn't let his guard down, he would have second place in his pocket. Lost and sad, the protagonist looked at the ground. Ilya, turning in his direction, noticed his depressed appearance. Aimed, making a hand gesture, shouted that it was 8.55, and he also said that he would now explain the rules of intermediate assessment once again. An image of the test route appeared. It consists of 4 stages. Each one has an instructor. Only after overcoming a stage will they be able to move on to the next one. The instructor noted that for the assessment, it is only important to meet the allotted time. He said not to let others confuse you. He noted that they need to show what progress they have made over time. An image appeared of several guys standing in front of the weights. Aim said to get ready to start. He shouted the start of the test. An image of the faces of Elijah, Brad, Judith and Iron appeared a moment after it began. The first stage is called the push press. The students began to bench press the barbell while standing. Ilya did an excellent job. She completed the task quickly and clearly, and concentration was reflected on her face. While doing the exercise, Brad turned to the girl and mentally said that she was fast as expected. He mentally noted that even if he exerted all his strength, he would not be able to keep up with her. Looking at his friends, he noted that besides Elijah and him, there were other participants. Many people had trouble doing the exercise. Brad's face showed that he was trying his best to pass the test. His eyes widened in surprise. One of the students actively did this exercise. The instructor, holding the documents in his hands, looked at him in surprise. It was the protagonist whose face was red. He tried very hard to do the fastest and most accurate repetitions. Looking in shock at the main character, who was screaming from the load, the blue-haired guy mentally asked him if he was in his right mind and if he planned to fall off his feet at the very beginning. Looking slightly offended and embarrassed at the passing girl, Brad heard that Ilya had passed the first stage. Looking at her back, he mentally declared that it was damn fast. The instructor shouted the name of the main character. Looking in shock towards the protagonist, the guy couldn't believe it. The exhausted protagonist went to the second stage. Looking at Iron, several people asked how this could happen. Someone said to forget about him, because by the end he would be out anyway. The protagonist jumped on the box with the thought that everyone should laugh as much as they want. He mentally stated that he understood their confusion. Once again putting all his strength into the jump, the guy noted that he was shocked by himself. He said that something in his body had changed, it was literally on fire, and in his head there were not only thoughts that this was his limit. His feet hitting the box made loud sounds. Opening his eyes wide, he mentally stated that this meant he was doing everything at his own pace. Aimed looked in shock at the accelerating protagonist. The main character thought that he needed to move even faster. He mentally noted that the current speed was not enough, and he needed to be more agile. He tried to psych himself up to speed up. Looking at him in surprise, the instructor announced that Iron had passed the second stage. Weightlifters Brad and his friends asked in disbelief how this was possible. The blue-haired guy looked back at the sound. Screaming with pain and effort, Judith lifted the barbell. The leader looked with a smile at the efforts of the new generation of students. Third stage, long-distance running. The protagonist, actively waving his arms, ran. The white-haired girl looked back when she heard the protagonist, less than 10 meters away. With a determined and confident look, the main character continued to run. Ilya ran confidently. Continuing to run and sweating, the main character mentally stated that he was experiencing some kind of wonderful feeling. Shaking his head slightly, he continued running. Raising his eyes, he confidently looked forward. Watching Elijah run, he declared in the flow that he wanted to get her out of his way. He instantly accelerated. Turning around, he was surprised. The shocked main character and Ilya saw a sharp jerk from Judith, who instantly completed the stages and overtook them. Opening his mouth slightly in surprise, the protagonist said her name. With her head down, she ran as fast as she could. Putting all her strength into every step, she mentally declared that she would never lose. She, remembering how day after day she did push-ups on the ground, putting every part of herself into training, she mentally spoke about what it cost her to be here. Several guys, watching the girl kneeling, were talking about whether she really applied to Chrono Academy, because she was not even from an aristocratic family. One of the guys also noted that she was just building castles in the air. Looking angrily at the red-haired girl, the guy said with disgust that she was trying to make herself special. He said she forgets what reality is and gets involved where she shouldn't, crossing the line. The girl dug into the sand with her scratched fingers. The guy's thoughts flashed through her head that she was interfering where she shouldn't, crossing the line. She hung on the horizontal bar with her legs and bent her body. She mentally said that she worked like hell to study at Chrono. She said that she would never give in to anyone. Repeating this, clenching her teeth, she continued to run. Jumping into the water, she mentally confidently declared that she would not allow anyone to overcome her. Fourth stage, long-distance swimming. The girl began to swim along the river with clear water. Quickly swallowing air, she swam, using all her strength to do so. Judith's eyes widened. She felt a sharp stabbing pain in her leg. Gritting her teeth in pain, through the pain she mentally asked why now. She hesitated for a second and looked ahead. Ilya overtook her. Looking at the actively swimming white-haired girl, Judith thought that she had really jumped in over her head and asked whether, even so, she really wouldn't succeed. She began to swim again. Looking at the back of white-haired girl, she mentally said that this was somehow a little. Tears streamed down her distressed face. She said through sadness that it was very offensive. Continuing to swim slowly, she felt pain and thought about the severity of the test. She began to dive headfirst into the water. Sinking deeper and deeper, she mentally retreated slightly from the world and thought that she really wanted to rest. She, starting to lose consciousness, felt something strange. The protagonist pulled the girl to the surface of the water. Through fatigue, holding the red-haired girl spitting out water, he began to swim. She vaguely opened her eyes and thought about who helped her. She looked at the tired, wet and diligent face of the protagonist, whose eyes reflected determination. While in the water, Iron holds Judith and struggles to get out. Looking at him, the girl surprises him with a question about what he is doing. While the young man swims, reporting that they are almost at the shore, she declares that he infuriates her. They crawl ashore, completely wet, and Judith coughs. Looking at her with concern, Iron asks if she is okay, but the man running towards them tells him to leave her to him and run quickly. While others jump into the water, the young man obediently leaves. He starts to run when the man tells him to be faster. The girl clenches her jaw as drops of water flow down her. She looks at Iron running up to the water, her eyes closed slightly as he jumps into the water. She calls him a fool. The body of a crying man and his tears on the ground are visible. The boy is in tears and he claims that he tried so hard, but he still didn't succeed. He turns his gaze upward when the guy declares that it is too early for him to lose heart. Smiling, he reports that he still has a second assessment awaiting him. Compared to the first, his passing criteria are much more loyal, and if he doesn't give up, he will definitely pass. Running away, the boy comes to the conclusion that then he will definitely cope, and a man approaches, claiming that he could not expect less from this year's students, who passed much more than last year. Raising his hand, the man agrees that this year everything is different. A lot of talent arrived, but some especially stood out. Iron is shown breathing heavily and is revealed to be the main rescue hero, ranked 34th out of 35. Smirking, the guy insults him and wonders why he needed to do stupid things in the exam. He believes Iron wanted to appear kind. He recalls that thanks to him, he took 5th place. The question is how he managed to become 5th. Arching his eyebrow, the boy notes that at such moments it is customary to congratulate him, and if he is jealous, let him say so while the other boy congratulates him, claiming that the leader will reward him and he is lucky. Lloyd approaches and also congratulates the boy. Placing his hand on his chest, the satisfied young man says that without Lloyd he would not have succeeded, to which he asks if he did anything, because he achieved everything himself. Lloyd turns his head as congratulations are heard for his 2nd place finish. He looks at Iron and thinks that with his current abilities, he won't be able to keep up with the level that Pereira showed today. He watches carefully, wondering what would have happened if Judith had distributed her powers correctly. It turns out that in this case the boys appear, and Lloyd admits that he was completely defeated. The events of the next day are shown. Iron is seen running. He sits down, breathing heavily. He looks away when he hears the question why he did this. A woman of strong build approaches him. The boy just looks at her questioningly. Eyes wide, she insists that he understands what she's talking about. Iron stands up when she asks if that's the case. She has a serious expression on her face when he asks if she means saving Judith, and answers in the affirmative. The young man frowns when the woman comes up and asks why he had to do that. Their legs are visible. Looking down, Iron reports that it seemed to him that there was no other choice. The girl frowns, asking if he can hear what nonsense he is saying. Because Judith would have been helped by the instructors, he had nothing to interfere with. And for such a stupid reason, he did not care about the award of the head of the academy, who is considered the best on the entire continent. She continues to speak out, revealing that he didn't even consider the chance to strike back at everyone who mocked and looked down on him, asking if he realized it. The battered hand of a guy is shown, who only remains silent in response. Looking ahead, he wonders if the girl knows that he was called a careless aristocrat. A young man is depicted in a swamp, and he reports that in the past he felt as if he had been there for a long time. There was something to justify this, but there was one thing. He gradually drowns, declaring that he didn't even try to get out. He starts talking about what happened to him in the end. A hand is shown pulling another. The boy, raising the corners of his eyebrows, looks at this man. It turns out that his beloved family pulled him out. Silhouettes of his relatives are depicted, one of whom holds his hand. Iron is shown determinedly swimming after Judith, saying that thanks to the help of a couple of people, he managed to rise to the surface, so he could not just pass by while watching the girl drown. Smiling, he claims that this is the whole reason, nothing more. Ilya just remains silent to this. She turns around, leaving, and remembers that the young man said that only last year he picked up a sword, to which he answers in the affirmative. Her face darkens, and she says that sword art and physical training are two different things. Talent and diligence are necessary in both cases, but in mastering sword art, talent plays a very important role, and perhaps because of his outburst yesterday, he missed the chance to receive personal instruction from the leader himself. She claims that she will no longer help him. Iron looks carefully at the girl, who talks about what will happen if he suddenly slides down due to the ridicule of others. She wishes him not to regret his choice. Unable to bear it, he calls her by name. He surprises her with a question about why she even needed to help him. She looks down, trying to find words. She leaves, stating that they don't like people talking about things they don't know. Iron remains standing in bewilderment. A crowd of people is visible, and an announcement is made that the results of the interim assessment will now be announced. 35 people passed the first exam, 78 passed the second, and a total of 113 passed. We are talking about what will happen to the 5 students who showed the most outstanding results in the first exam. Several young people stand, and it becomes known that after a personal conversation with the head of the academy, they will be presented with awards. The gray-haired man reports that the speaker forgot someone. There is a request from student number 311, Iron, to come up to the podium. He looks dumbfounded. Ilya and Lloyd are also surprised. There is a saying that rivalry is a funny thing. Smiling, the man says that when a person goes out of his way to catch up with an opponent who is pulled ahead and not be overtaken by those running behind, he has the opportunity to demonstrate stunning abilities that he may not expect from himself. Shoes are shown, and the message is told that if you focus too much on the outcome, there is a chance of losing sight of something more important. Looking at the guys, the man claims that Iron is not like that because in a situation where, due to an accidental mistake, he could slide straight into hell, he sacrificed his time and saved his drowning comrade. The boy stands while everyone behind him is amazed, and the man states that there may be many opinions regarding what happened, but he and all the instructors agreed that his action had its value. It is reported that this is why they ask Iron to come up to them. The men clap for him. Judith, smiling, also gives him her applause. Iron appears somewhat embarrassed and looks down. Lloyd, sitting in his chair, concludes that he now realizes that he was thinking too narrowly before. The gray-haired man, smiling, claims that he has no reason to humiliate himself because a person with narrow thinking would not be able to admit his weaknesses. But the guy declares that he was arrogant and stubborn, adhered only to his methods, and as the man advised, from now on, if he meets a person from whom he can learn something, he will not miss this opportunity. Bowing, Lloyd asks permission to take his leave. The guy is depicted with a confident smile, and the idea is conveyed that he is talented, clearly understands his position, and shows a willingness to overcome his own shortcomings, and besides, he has excellent leadership skills. Looking down, the man thinks that Lloyd is not deprived of the stubbornness and self-confidence inherent in the highest aristocrats, of course, but everything is not so bad that he starts to worry. He believes that another time he would definitely have taken first place. Ilya is already sitting opposite him, and the thought is heard that, unfortunately, many capable students have arrived this year. The girl looks seriously and declares that as a reward, she would like to spar with him. Looking closely at the response, the man argues that this is a smart choice. He continues to look at her and tells her that he will give her advice about not letting others take control of her and that she should live her own life. Ilya looks at him in surprise when he tells her not to waste time here for the sake of affection, but to go home and learn the family's sword techniques, because it will be much more useful for her. Frowning, the girl asks to spar with him, to which he replies that it was foolish for him to expect a different reaction. They sit across from each other, and the man reveals that his office is spacious, asking if she would be willing to conduct training here, after which she thanks him. Exhaling, he realizes that this is finally the last one. Looking at Iron, he asks if he wants any reward and tells him to say it, even if it's something intangible. He watches him carefully, thinking that his answer interests him most. Iron awkwardly reveals that he wants to make peace with someone, and he wonders how he can do it. He looks down, realizing how absurd it sounds, but he has no one else to ask for advice, so he apologizes. The man calmly asserts that he has nothing to apologize for, and even thanks him for his sincerity, remembering that the boy did not leave his room until he was 15. He sits with his eyes downcast, and it is reported that now, among his peers, he is completely confused. The thought sounds that someone has nevertheless become close to him, a child whom others make fun of. The man smiles, asking him to tell him what happened. After some time, the boy thanks him, claiming that he helped a lot, to which the man replies that if so, he is glad, because he has not had the opportunity to give advice not related to fencing for a long time. He introduces Ilya, thinking that the fact that Iron wanted to make peace with her is unexpected and more amazing things are happening this year. Looking up at the boy, he suggests moving on to the main point now that they have dealt with his problem, which raises questions in his mind. Smiling, he says that he will not count the small tip towards the reward. Iron is shown perplexed, while the man asks to be allowed to express himself specifically and says that he wants to give him instructions regarding sword training, because he is more competent in such a matter. He wonders what the boy wants to know. Closing his eyes, Iron apologizes, saying that nothing comes to mind. Putting his hand to his chin, the man listens as the boy claims that, in truth, he only practiced fencing on his own for a month before entering the academy. So although he is embarrassed to admit it, he does not understand what he wants or what question he should ask. The man calls him by name. He sits with his eyes downcast and apologizes, claiming that everyone is just talking about how amazing it is to get a personal lesson from a leader. He apologizes that he cannot use it. Suddenly, he gets scared when the man claps his hands. With a serious expression on his face, he wonders why Iron constantly apologizes and states that he does not need to do that because a good swordsman must be confident in himself. He asks if he agrees, when the boy looks surprised and answers in the affirmative. The leader's feet are shown, and he says that the young man will exercise his right to a reward another time, and if he feels that something is missing, he can safely come to him, or he himself will give him a lesson when he considers it necessary. With his back to the boy, he asks if he has any objections, to which he bows, answering in the negative and thanking him. They tell him to step. Iron walks down the street with his hands clenched into fists. The man looks at him from the window, concluding that he is truly an unusual young man. He comes to the conclusion that something doesn't add up here. Looking down, the leader thinks that the boy does not have a single drop of anxiety and worry about his ignorance regarding the art of the sword. On the contrary, it feels as if he has already set a clear goal. A young man is shown with a man behind him, and the idea is heard that someone is guiding him. Lost in thought, the man claims that, come to think of it, he has already met a similar person before. A person with long hair is depicted, and the talk is about talent and confidence. He turns around and it turns out that he has an unpredictable character. A window is shown, and the idea is heard that they are still complete opposites. Iron is seen doing push-ups. Judith looks at him, arching her eyebrow, and says that she, of course, assumed that he was practicing again, but she is still surprised. Fencing lessons begin tomorrow. From now on they will train only with swords. The young man stands up, looking at her in surprise, and asks why she came, to which the girl awkwardly claims that she wanted to say something. Blushing, she thanks him, which confuses Iron. She frowns, declaring that she will definitely repay the debt, so he has nothing to worry about, to which he says that he has not even thought about it. Arching an eyebrow, the girl invites him to get along. The boy puts his hand on his chest in surprise, to which Judith claims that she is offering him to be friends and that he always ate alone, and now they will do it together. When the young man wants to say something in response, she states that they can also train with swords together, and asks if that's cool. She feigns joy and punches Iron. Her face turns intimidating as she tells him to answer, which causes him to respond positively. She leaves, waving her hand, and says that she will not distract him and he can study, and she will go, to which the young man remembers that she is 3 years younger than him. He holds his sore hand, smiling, and realizes that, be that as it may, he is glad. He looks up in surprise when the girl asks if he heard the song about the turtle and threats to eat it, and answers in the negative. The young men look at her in confusion when one of them notices that she has changed and asks if Lloyd thinks it's strange. He believes that she hit her head, and the girl, laughing, clarifies whether the young man seriously does not know this song. Another guy reports that it gives him goosebumps. Lloyd looks at the young people carefully, realizing that the strange thing here is completely different. He sees Aaliyah in the crowd and notices that she and Iron have moved away from each other. He wonders what happened between them. Stomping his foot, the man asks for everyone's attention. Crossing his arms over his chest, he says that, as everyone knows, fencing classes begin today, where they will feel the result of the past 4 months of training. It is reported that from now on everyone will be able to freely wield a sword for 2 hours. Young people take swords, but someone cannot choose, and it becomes known that, under the supervision of instructors, they need to choose the wooden sword they like. Judith swings her sword in admiration and notices that even if she swings harder, her body remains balanced. The teachers stand smiling. It sounds like they not only made them stronger and more resilient. Swinging the sword, Lloyd thinks that even though the sword is wooden, it feels completely different than before. He reports that he feels it with his whole body. Suddenly he pays attention to something. The legs of someone walking, or everyone else, also turns their attention to this person. Ilya looks at Iron as he passes. The shoes of a person who is already standing are shown. The young man stops in front of a huge sword and looks at it. He carefully removes it from the wall. He takes it in his hands, examining it carefully. The leader smiles as he watches him. The young man decides to swing his sword. His swing creates a large gust of wind. The young people look at him dumbfounded. One of them, shocked, claims that there is nothing special about it. Looking at the boy in surprise, the man with the mustache concludes that his pose was a little inaccurate. However, another man appears, and the idea is heard that Iron's stance is almost close to exemplary. Ilya looks at what is happening with wide eyes. Laughing, the boy states that he heard that Pereira had never practiced fencing, and another suggests that he decided to take a huge sword and show off. Lloyd's furrowed brows are visible. He takes off when his name is called. Judith looks at him questioningly. He approaches Iron, who is confused, and calls out to him. Putting his sword forward, the guy claims that he is challenging Iron to a duel. Everyone is in absolute shock about this. The boy is at a loss. He looks away. The manager nods at him, smiling. Lowering his head, the young man is silent. Frowning, he declares that he agrees to the proposal. Young people stand opposite each other. The red-haired man, frowning, asks what they were up to and says that they will train after the lesson. The green-haired man, thoughtful, wonders why Lloyd challenged Iron to a duel, while the man shouts that the guys took his permission to use weapons at any time too literally. He wants to say that there should be order in everything. The smiling leader steps forward, asserting that there are exceptions. He gives his permission to conduct a duel. He stands between 2 young men with swords. Looking ahead, he says that he will make a reservation right away that if someone is in danger, he will intervene and asks if the guys agree. Looking at each other carefully, they confidently answer in the affirmative. They are told to start the fight. Lloyd swings his sword while standing in the distance. Suddenly, he takes off from his spot with a determined expression on his face. Iron stands holding a sword in his hands and frowns. He looks ahead in shock. Lloyd suddenly stabs him. He is as serious as possible. Defending himself with his sword, the boy reports his surprise. The blue-haired man confidently swings his sword. He points its tip forward. The sword passes right next to Iron's face. He slides his feet along the ground. He defends himself with his huge sword from Lloyd's blows. As the young men watch their fight, one of them claims that he expected Lloyd to kill the second duelist with one blow. The phrase says that the guy is still holding on. Judith watches the scene with a frown. She clenches her jaw, thinking about what the young man is like. Lloyd frowns, and another swing of the sword occurs. He is reported to be checking up on Iron. Pereira stands with his sword already raised as Lloyd steps back. He looks carefully at his opponent, noticing that Iron's reaction speed is not bad, but the sword easily destroys his body balance. As he breathes heavily, the blue-haired man realizes that his stance and movements are very inept and wonders if he is really interested in fencing. He concludes that Pereira's skills are far more terrible than he thought. He thinks about what will happen, if so. He rushes forward, asking what about the power. Iron looks at him, eyes wide. He raises a huge sword above his head. Lloyd looks at his actions, dumbfounded. The tip of a young man's sword approaches him. He immediately steps back. Suddenly, he finds himself at the side of his opponent and swings his sword. He looks at him, raising the corners of his eyebrows. Iron notices him, surprised. The sword flies out of his hands. He falls to the ground with a crash. Lloyd's sword ends up near the young man's neck. The battle is reported to be over. Lloyd looks at Iron, frowning. The announcement of his victory sounds. It's noticeable how it unfolds. Some particles are flying. The man, holding a sheet of paper in his hands, begins to talk about the last item in their schedule for today and that they have divided everyone into classes, and from tomorrow fencing classes will be held in a certain composition. We are talking about Class A, in which there are only 10 people, including Elijah, Lloyd, and Judith. The named young people are depicted. It is reported that, as befits the strongest class, compared to the other guys, their training will be much tougher and more difficult, so they need to mentally prepare themselves. Looking at the sheet, the man names the following names and says that there are only 35 people in Class B, and now he will move on to Class C. Smiling, Judith tells the young man to trust her. They both look in surprise when it becomes known that there will be 54 people in Class C, and Iron was not named. His name is immediately announced. The man stands with his hand holding the sheet down. The young man is dumbfounded when he is informed that he has been assigned to Class F. Frowning. Judith shouts that Lloyd acted like a fool. While Iron holds the sword in his hands, she states that she is sure that the guy used it to boast of his superiority over the others. Everyone already knows that he is an aristocrat, so she wonders if just flaunting his status is amusing his ego. Closing her eyes, the girl tells Iron not to be sad because they just need to grind the fool into powder before the final assessment. She states that she is infuriated by those people who follow Lloyd on his heels. Iron looks at her in surprise, and she asks what is the reason for this. He tells her not to be angry because he really is very grateful for her experiences, but he feels uneasy when she gets angry because of him. Judith blushed all over, looking at him questioningly. She asks who said it was because of him. The young man asks her not to hit him because he is already covered in bruises. A room and a made bed are shown. Lloyd, closing his eyes, wipes his hair with a towel. He falls onto the bed, exhaling. He opens his eyes, looking at the ceiling. He thinks about that moment. He remembers that he was about to meet his frontal attack. The moment is shown again when the sword was flying straight at him, and he realizes that, without realizing it, he dodged. He is thoughtful and notices that it was not just the sword, because at that moment Iron's eyes, the expression on his face, absolutely everything expressed power that was impossible for him to overcome. It sounds like Pereira concentrated his entire being into a vertical strike. Lloyd sits down on the bed, clenching his hand into a fist. He thinks about himself. He looks down sadly. The question arises about what expression he had on his face when he wielded the sword. Lund frowns, asking if the young man knows any blows other than perpendicular and oblique, to which he answers in the affirmative and asks for forgiveness. Smiling, the man says that he has nothing to apologize for because he did not study the art of fencing properly and asks whether he can show a good result at the beginning of his journey. He claims that he will ask another question. When he wonders what it takes for a young man who is far behind other guys in fencing to catch up with them in skill, when Iron looks at him questioningly, suggesting that he needs to put in more effort, a negative response is received. A hand is shown holding a huge sword. The man suddenly swings his sword. There is a statement that the young man needs talent. Lund thrusts his sword into the ground as seriously as possible. The lines from his swing are visible, and he reports that, of course, efforts are also important, because depending on his efforts, Iron can either stand on par with the rest of the students or even surpass them many times over. But this is not all about him, since others have learned fencing several years ago. He claims to give the boy a week. At this he frowns in shock, smirking. Lund tells him during this time to learn all the basics of wielding a large sword, and if he succeeds, he will immediately be assigned to with a serious expression on his face, asks what will happen if he fails, to which the man replies that then nothing will change. He will remain in his class, and will continue to study fencing. It turns out there is one thing. He puts his hand on the young man's shoulder, smiling. He advises him to leave the academy on his own if he feels he lacks talent. Clenching his hands into a fist, Iron declares that he will try hard, to which Lund claims that he should try, because he has already been convinced that he will not lack diligence. The young man, clenching his jaw, swings his sword. The second day of training is coming. As Iron swings his sword, Lund tells him to lower his stance and relax his shoulders. On the third day of training, he praises him when the boy bends over and makes a swing. On the fifth day of training, sitting on the seat, the man reports that he just had a good stance. He stands with his arms crossed on his sixth day of training. Frowning, he notices that Iron is improving his skills faster and faster every day. His efforts played a big role in this, and even the man was not like that. The young man is breathing heavily, and the thought is heard that something does not seem at first glance. However, it is reported that he does have a talent for fencing. Iron stands holding his sword in front of him. He looks at Judith, asking her to take one look because he has an assessment tomorrow, to which the girl reports that she is picky in this regard, so if everything is bad, she will beat him. She, smiling, watches the actions of the young man. Suddenly, surprise appears on her face. Sweating, Iron looks at her, asking how she's doing. Judith just gives her a thumbs up and smiles. You can see the blue sky and birds flying there. Long is sitting in glasses, sipping a drink from a mug, when his name is joyfully called, noticing that he went to work in the rehabilitation department today. Smiling, the man confirms this. Iron stands with a sword in his hands and is covered in sweat when it becomes known that he has entered Class C. Judith eats not the first plate of food. She amazes the young man when she tells him to take more food. Because he knows as well as she how important calories are, he works out harder than she does and eats very little, which he agrees with. Passing by, Lance believes that they have a hippopotamus at the academy because the girl took a lot of food. Turning around, she indifferently asks if he likes her. She notices that the guy is embarrassed and asks for forgiveness because nothing will work out for them since he is not her type. Looking at her seriously, Lance asks if she's crazy. Lloyd surprises the guys when he tells them to stop doing this and follow him, and they obey him. He has his back turned and wants to say something else. Everyone is perplexed when he tells them to stop talking about others because it won't do them any good. Smiling, Judith notices that this impudent guy has calmed down lately. Iron looks to the side questioningly. He notices Elijah approaching the table. Smirking, Judith claims that the two of them are not communicating well these days and asks if they quarreled, to which the young man replies in the negative, surprised. He looks down, wondering if what happened can even be called a quarrel, and the girl wonders what he was thinking about. The young man turns his gaze to her, asking how Elijah is doing, because they go to the same class with her and see each other often. Crossing her arms, Judith reminds him that he said he and Milady weren't arguing, so he should go and ask her himself. She smiles maliciously, saying that she is joking and could not resist, because he reacts in a funny way, but in the end she agrees to tell him. Elijah begins to eat when the girl claims that in general nothing special is going on with her, because she still takes first place in the class and shows excellent results, which even the instructors cannot help but recognize as such. The silhouette of Elijah is depicted, and Judith reports that due to the large difference in abilities, the guys feel uncomfortable, so they don't even approach her. Including her, she also heard that in the evenings the girl goes to work out at a small training ground, and seems to be honing the family's sword techniques or something. Iron puts his palms forward when Judith suggests that he spend time with Elias, since he has leveled so quickly, to which he asks her to stop mocking him. He sighs heavily when asked if he's ready. Traces of the movements of young people are visible. Lloyd stands with his arms crossed over his chest. Judith moves her hand back, putting the other forward. She swings her sword over Iron's head. Her eyes sparkle. She frowns in concentration as she swings her sword again. She and the young man clash weapons. Iron thinks that he expected nothing less from Judith, and her attacks are difficult to repel. He looks ahead in fear. He understands its unimaginable power. The young man also swings his sword, and the girl steps back. He suddenly takes off. He approaches Judith, decisively swinging his sword at her. Looking at him carefully, the girl realizes that he is using a vertical section. She tries to stand still after the attack. Suddenly she is struck again, and she clenches her jaw, turning her gaze to her sword. They both smile confidently as they look at each other. The young man tightly clutches his sword in his hands. Judith watches him, frowning. She immediately attacks the stunned Iron, who swung. He frowns, sweating. He flies off into the distance, falling to the ground. Large clouds of dust can be seen. The girl claims that he has really grown in his skills, and the progress is clearly visible. Sitting down next to him, she smiles, declaring that he cares about her like the moon. Getting up, she turns and says that they will finish for today, because it is already night and they are left here alone. Turning her gaze to the young man, she claims that if he goes to the small training ground now, there is a high chance of finding Elijah there, to which he tells her to stop. He looks away, sighing. Elijah is shown holding a sword. She closes her eyes, concentrating. Her shoes are visible, and only silence is heard. She has the most serious look. Suddenly she turns her head, frowning, asking. She sees Iron awkwardly holding out something. Shrugging his shoulders, he greets her. Ilya, looking at him questioningly, asks what he needs. Smiling, he says that he came here to give her something. Ilya looks in surprise at the things he holds out when he claims that he asked for a gift to be sent to him from home and drafted the letter. He thinks it's a bit unexpected. Arching an eyebrow, the girl asks why she needs this. The young man only says that he has a younger sister. He remembers her frowning and states that she is not good at communicating with people, just like him. She is shown yelling at him, and it turns out that due to misunderstandings, they often fought. He smiles and looks at the gift and letter, and reports that the next morning he finds it by his bed. Removing his hand behind his head, Iron smiles awkwardly and claims that he also lacks eloquence. He doesn't even know where he should start a conversation because he has trouble communicating, so he thought it would be better to express his thoughts on paper as he likes to his sister. Frowning, Ilya asks if he thinks that after reading the letter she will start helping him again, which leaves the young man confused. The phrase sounds like it's normal for him anyway. He turns away, looking down, and asks for forgiveness for interrupting, saying that he is already leaving. The girl looks at him sadly. The dark night sky is shown. Ilya, with her hair down, smiling, reads Iron's letter and claims that he is like a little child. She draws attention to the gift bag. Opening it, she discovers a bracelet and takes it in her hand. She suddenly finds herself surprised by something. She notices what the bracelet is. Her hand shakes as she holds the bracelet. She realizes that this is Adonis. The girl bites her lip, starting to sweat in horror. She is shown from the back. Suddenly, everything becomes brighter. She raises her eyebrows and looks to the side. She looks out the window, where it is already dawn. She believes that it was in vain to accuse Iron of something that she herself did not know. Judith is shown warming up and a young man standing next to her. She, closing her eyes, declares that today will be more severe, and Iron awkwardly suggests not to rush. A man is seen walking. Lloyd's head is shown. The girl turns her gaze to the side questioningly. When he approaches, she asks if he has come to pester them again. He seriously claims that he and she have a conversation, but she needs to wait, and the girl, frowning, asks what to talk about. Iron is surprised when he addresses him. Everyone is surprised when the guy says that he would like to train together in the future. Courier raises his eyebrows in surprise when Lloyd reveals that in the midterm assessment and last duel he showed great concentration, which he lacks, so he would like him to teach it to him. Placing his hand on his chest, he states that he is offering sword lessons in return, and invites him to help each other overcome their shortcomings in order to move forward together. Judith, standing on the sidelines, looked in confusion as Brad asked Iron to train together. Iron himself dropped his hands in surprise and looked at him with his mouth open. Throwing her training sword over her shoulder, Judith, resting her other hand on her side, asked in disbelief what the joke was. Brad, with his head held high, looked at her with complete indifference in his eyes, while Iron was insanely confused, beads of sweat running down his face, and there was confusion in his eyes. Then Judith continued that last time he challenged Iron to a duel, and now this trick, after which she defiantly asked Brad if he really wanted to use Iron to rise up himself. Surprised by this statement, Brad looked at the offender with offense, after which, after thinking a little, he confirmed her words about using Iron for his own purposes. Judith was taken aback by such an honest answer. Beads of sweat ran down her face, her eyebrows furrowed, and she screamed, insulting Brad for being an insolent mug. Brad, smiling sarcastically, asked what was wrong with that. Looking at the still confused Iron, he added that he could achieve excellent results alone. The students pointed training weapons at each other and practiced fighting each other. Looking at this, Brad said that in this academy the approach of training alone is ineffective. Besides, he already turned to Judith and Iron. They will also use it, just as he uses them. Judith listened in surprise to what Brad was saying, confusion in her eyes. Then Brad remembered Judith, that she herself left classes all the time to train with Iron. So he believes that he should gain experience from many people, because knowledge does not end with the academy program. Throwing his clenched hand forward, Brad, with a serious face and perseverance in his eyes, loudly said that this was their chance, adding that, under the pressure of fierce competition, he would learn new things from other students and achieve qualitative growth in his abilities. Watching Judith, Iron and Brad talk, two other students, a boy and a girl, were talking among themselves, surprised that a student from class wanted to study with a student from class. See, a drop of sweat ran down the boy's cheek. He gritted his teeth and said how cool it was. Meanwhile, Iron agreed with Brad's proposal and asked if he was sure that this was a good idea. Judith was shocked by Iron's answer. Her mouth open and her eyes dumbfounded, she looked at him. But still, Iron didn't really understand why Brad needed this, and then he, with confusion in his eyes, said that he was behind him in all respects, which he planned to learn from him. Smiling and pleased with the answer, Brad replied that he had a lot to learn from him. With his brows furrowed, Brad said with complete seriousness that he had been thinking about this since the end of the midterm. Remembering what happened after the midterm assessment, Brad had an image in his head of him training until he was exhausted, wondering why there was such a difference between him and Iron, since they spent the same amount of time training. It turns out that Iron is different from him in some other way, Brad thought. Brad, tired from training, with drops of sweat on his face, continued to think about how Iron was different from him, when suddenly it dawned on him. Remembering how hard Iron trained in the gym, he realized that all the students were given a limited amount of time. And remembering Iron's strong downward blow with a large sword, he realized that the amount of time varied. From the very beginning of training, Iron never lost concentration. After Brad told Iron all this, he asked Iron to teach him how to maintain a focused mindset all day long. Iron was surprised by this request. He lowered his head in shame. After thinking for a while, he said that he himself didn't know how it turned out this way. Turning around and preparing to leave, Brad told a confused Iron that this was the expected answer, adding that all geniuses think alike. Iron just mumbled that he is not what he sees him as. Having stopped, Brad, with respect in his eyes and a smile on his face, said that just one glance is enough to recognize his talent, because constantly maintaining concentration at the same level is far from an easy task. As Brad left, he looked askance at Judith and grinned, saying that she would join them tomorrow. Judith became angry at this statement and shouted indignantly that she had not given consent. But suddenly Brad stopped, standing with his back to Iron. He decided to give him one more piece of advice. Turning to Iron, Brad told him to never put himself down. Iron looked at him in confusion, sweat still flowing down his face, and there was confusion in his eyes. He couldn't come to his senses, and Brad continued that he is a descendant of the noble blood of the Pereira family. And although Brad is not sure about the beginning, but now his actions and skills are quite comparable to a member of the noble family, so let Iron have pride and show everyone your confidence. With a malicious smile, Brad turned around and left. Judith, holding her fist to her mouth, said that he was an expert at scratching with his tongue, asking Iron if he felt as nauseous as she did. But these words had a very good effect on Iron. The excitement disappeared from his face. a slight smile appeared on him, and there was calmness in his eyes. The day of general training has arrived. Brad controlled Iron to make sure he was making the right shots and movements. Having made another blow, Brad said that Iron was in a hurry. Brad undertook to show how to do it correctly. Holding a sword in his hand, he held it out in front of him, explaining that his movements would only be accurate when he achieved balance between his body and gait. After these words, Brad made a sharp lunge forward, cutting the air with his sword. Iron was surprised by what he saw. After finishing training, Judith walked past Brad and Iron. Brad, noticing her, said that their training was over and invited her to fight, to which she angrily shouted that she had already said before that she would not. Brad laughed at this situation, saying that she was stubborn, and then asked Iron how long she would last. Tired Iron, also laughing, replied that since there were no curses, then for about a week. Sitting in the dining room, Judith loudly finished her 5th serving, and Iron, looking at her, only ate half of the first. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. It was Ilya. She walked past him with a plate of food, and without any emotion, she looked back at her former comrade. Walking further, she carefully shouted to him that she had read his letter, to which Iron breathed a sigh of relief and smiled. At that same second, Judith leaned towards him, mockingly asking if it was a letter of confession. Iron immediately blushed, trying to justify himself by saying that Judith had misunderstood everything. Night. The night sky is dotted with stars and almost completely covered with clouds. Iron lay in bed without closing his eyes and thought about Brad's words. He thought about concentration. Closing his eyes, he wondered how to improve it. Having fallen asleep, a black male silhouette appeared in front of him. In Iron's thoughts, there was a desire to move forward at least a little. Suddenly, he found himself on the ground, and in front of him was a long-haired man with a two-handed sword in his hand. His body was translucent. Stretching his arm forward, smoke came out of it, and its transparency disappeared. Iron then wondered if this was really a dream. Drops of sweat were running down his face. He looked at his hand in horror, saying that he could clearly feel it. Fully materialized, he folded his hands as if holding the hilt of a sword, and said that this dream was not the same as before, adding that he felt not only his hands, but his entire body. The man in front of Iron raised his sword behind his head and swung it. His body was covered in scars and abrasions, and all his sensations were clear to Iron as day. Iron immediately woke up screaming, covered in sweat, eyes filled with fear. Having calmed down a little, Iron looked out the window and realized that it was still night outside. The moon illuminated the academy, and Iron ran to the training hall for his sword until those feelings disappeared. Morning came, the sun illuminated everything around. In the training room, Judith, seeing the exhausted and sleepy Iron, asked him what he had been doing all night, to which he told her not to worry. There was a practice duel between Brad and Judith. Standing opposite each other, Brad shouted at her not to relax, to which she shouted at him to stop showing off. Suddenly Brad noticed something was wrong and looked behind Judith in surprise, to which she immediately reacted with screams that he himself told her not to relax, but he himself was doing this. Turning around, Judith saw Iron sleeping and innocent on the bench. She immediately screamed for him to wake up, but Brad interrupted her, telling her to leave him. But those screams were enough for Iron to wake up. He quickly sat up, took his sword, and asked what it was. At that same second, he stood up and struck with his sword, after which he immediately put the sword against the wall and went back to sleep on the bench. Seeing this, Brad was surprised. He did not understand what it was just now. Approaching Iron, who was sleeping on the bench, Brad woke him up. Iron immediately jumped up, sitting on the bench. Then Brad, a little embarrassed and apologizing for disturbing him, asked him what he was doing. Iron didn't know what to answer. After thinking a little, he chuckled slightly, closed and scratched the back of his head, and said that he was trying to improve his concentration, although it wasn't working very well yet. Then Brad asked him with admiration if he meditated, additionally asking if he calmed his soul and looked back into the past to do this. Confused, Iron could not say anything other than somehow confirm his words. Hearing this, Brad lay down on a nearby bench, saying that he definitely needed to try this once. Relaxing, he said in his head that this was not as bad as he thought, after which he said that he needed to become even calmer. Then he heard someone calling him. Opening his eyes, he saw a student in front of him. As soon as Brad sat down on the bench, the student said that he thought he was sleeping, to which Brad immediately said that he was not sleeping, but meditating. At this time, Judith walked behind with a malicious smile. She decided to laugh at Brad, so she said that during meditation he was snoring and drooling. Hearing this, Brad, flushed with shame, began to wipe his mouth, and the student who woke him closed his eyes and did not dare laugh. Then Brad sat in the lotus position, saying that the whole problem was in the pose. Seeing this, Judith came up to him and, holding her hands on her belt with a condemning face, told him that he was suffering from a trifle and that he should admit that Iron had been given this. Brad, looking at her, with some disbelief at her words, said that it would be better for him to try first and then judge. At this time, the head of the academy was standing in the office by the window through which the sun was shining, asking if anything interesting had happened lately. Behind him stood Karaka, who, throwing his hand in front of him, said that everything was going as usual, saying only that Iron had moved to Class B hearing such news. The leader looked in surprise towards the assistant, and Karaka, in turn, said that Iron, thanks to the help of Judith and Brad, quickly improved his skills. Smiling and closing his eyes, he said that the leader was right. Then, opening his eyes, he added that Brad had caused a small wave of changes this year. Meanwhile, all the students of the academy were sitting on the floor in the lotus position and meditating, repeating after Brad. Lesson: Judith's sword falls to the floor with a crash. Aim said the fight was over. Brad stood opposite the defeated Judith, and Aim was not far from them, declaring Brad the winner. The departing winner, who had a malicious smile on his face and could see the pleasure of victory, was stopped by Judith. Holding her stomach and leaning on her sword, with anger on her face, she shouted that this did not count and offered to repeat the fight again. Seeing this, Aim shouted for Judith to stop this. Judith was very offended by this, because she really wanted to get even, and she walked away with an upset face. After a while, approaching Brad, Judith pointed her finger at the battlefield and said that after the lesson she would wait for him for another battle. Laughing, Brad accepted her challenge. All the while watching their argument, Aim thought in his head how amazing these guys are. They are both developing their skills at an incredible speed. Looking at Brad, who continued to argue with Judith, with his hands on his hips and a permanent smile on his face, Aim realized that Brad was developing faster than Judith, and a gap was gradually beginning to emerge between the two of them, who were previously fighting for second place. And at this time, Brad looked at his hand, saying that his whole body felt how it was getting better. Clenching his hand into a fist, he added that if he continues in the same spirit, before he could finish speaking, his gaze was caught by the silhouette of a girl. It was Ilya, who was practicing with the sword, not paying attention to Brad. At this time, Iron was training in the forest. He was covered in sweat, dirt, and abrasions. In his head, he said that meditation helped him improve his results. His face tensed, sweat continued to drip down his face, and his eyes held nothing but confidence. He continued to say that this was still not enough. He needed a little more. Suddenly, Brad called him. Brad and Judith appeared behind Iron, coming to check on their friend. Iron didn't expect to see them here, so he was a little scared, and at that time Brad asked him if he was too focused on just one perpendicular blow. Coming closer, Brad extended his hand to Iron and told him to finish and go with them, because the leader was asking everyone to get ready. All this time Judith stood behind him and said nothing. Iron agreed to go with them, asking where everything would take place. Brad immediately replied that everything would take place in the training arena. Hearing such an answer, Iron, who rose from the ground and did not have time to put on his uniform, looked at his comrade with surprise in his eyes. Everyone had already gathered in the arena, and the manager stood in front of the students, taking a step forward. He, looking at all the students, began to say that 9 months from the moment they entered the academy flew by unnoticed. Iron, Judith, and Brad sat in the front rows, listening carefully to the leader. The leader continued that he was incredibly glad that everyone managed to pass a large number of exams and harsh training, and he was proud of the brilliant progress of the students. He stopped. After a short silence, he said it was time to get to the point. Looking around at all the students, he said that the conversation would be about the final assessment. Hearing this, the expressions on all the students' faces were close to shock and maximum surprise. Brad opened his mouth at what he heard, a bead of sweat running down his cheek, and there was confusion in his eyes. The leader continued that it would be different from the intermediate one, in which they had to fulfill a certain norm of a discipline, adding that this may sound a little abstract, but at the final assessment, the leader fell silent. After a few seconds of pause, he smiled maliciously and continued that he would like to see the hidden talents of the students. Iron was shocked. He was wary of further information. The leader, seeing the reactions of all the students, laughed, saying that there is no need to be scared and there is no need to start frantically looking for the meaning in his words, adding that all that is required of them is demonstrate the best side of themselves, in the opinion of the students, with the help of a sword. Closing his eyes, he said that they could show some secret blow or an unusual maneuver to confuse the enemy. In other words, they were all allowed to resort to any means to show their capabilities, after which he immediately said that he is confident that everyone who is in this arena is able to reveal their strengths. With that said, he asked everyone to give their all in the remaining 3 months. The leader thought for a moment and fell silent, but the very next second he took off his cape. He held a one-handed sword in front of him, a barely noticeable aura emanating from it. Seeing the leader with the sword, Iron was scared, there was fear in his eyes, and sweat was running down his face. The old man continued, saying that even if this was just an old man's dance with a sword in his own way, he would be very grateful if someone suddenly learned something from it for themselves. The leader closed his eyes and concentrated. Concentrating, he opened his eyes and was ready to begin the performance. He swung his sword, followed by a long and very bright trail. Ilya was shocked by what she saw, her eyes filled with surprise, her mouth slightly open, and a bead of sweat running down her cheek. The old man continued to cut the air with his sword, and behind his blade, a beautiful trail continued to follow. Judith watched such a beautiful sight with her mouth open. She was surprised. Her eyes were full of surprise. Sweat was running down her face. Behind her stood another student whose reaction was similar to Judith's, and at this time, the leader gracefully swung his blade, cutting through the wind, blow after blow, leaving behind him a white blinding light. The old man spun in place to create beautiful patterns, and then cut through the air. Everyone, without exception, was fascinated and surprised by what was happening. The leader continuously cut the air with his blade. Iron watched this silently. The old man was preparing for the end of the dance. Taking a careful and precise step, he was about to make the final move. Having lunged and cut the air in front of him, the old man stopped. Brad was surprised by this performance. He couldn't find the words to say anything. Having bowed, the leader said that the show was over. Passing by surprised students who did not even dare to move, he wished them all good luck. One of the students tapped the other on the shoulder, asking what he had just seen, but his friend was silent. After a pause, he said something about the blade. Suddenly it dawned on him, and he screamed, asking what happened to him with the blade. Today, the sun illuminates the entire building. After training, Judith and Brad, covered in bruises, decided to sit on the bench. Then Brad decided to ask about the leader's performance shown yesterday. He thought it was something and asked Judith if she had the same opinion. She did not answer, but silently looked at the floor. Without waiting for an answer, Brad continued to say that he even felt embarrassed, after which he indignantly asked who he was talking to. Judith didn't answer. A moment later, she furiously screamed at Brad, telling him to shut up. Laughing, he asked her if she was really not in the mood. They both watched the others train. After a short silence, Brad asked if she was like this because of Iron. Judith indignantly asked what he had to do with it. At that moment, she fell silent, lowering her head. Having gathered her strength, she finally decided to ask if everything would be okay, because the final assessment was coming soon, and he was completely immersed in meditation. To this, Brad answered without a doubt that he was 100% sure that he would pass. An angry Judith shouted how he knew. Brad stood up and asked her what the final grading criteria were. Confused by the question, Judith said that hidden talents needed to be shown. Smiling maliciously, Brad turned to her and confirmed her words. Then he explained that they needed to show not their current abilities, but their future ones. Judith did not understand what he was saying and looked at him in surprise. Brad kept asking her who had shown the most hidden talents and made the fastest progress in 9 months at the academy. Jumping up, enraged by the questions, Judith replied that it was clear who the stump was. Before she could finish speaking, Brad himself answered his own question, saying that it was Iron, adding that she should stop worrying. Taking the sword in her hands, Judith said with a smile on her face that she will demonstrate her skills to the fullest and the first place will be in her pocket. Standing opposite her and taking the sword, Brad destroyed her dreams by saying that Ilya would take first place this time too, to which the angry Judith angrily asked why her again. Brad answered her question by saying that she comes from a family of an outstanding family of swordsmen, and such families can be counted on one hand, adding that the Lynch family studies martial arts, which helped them get the title of an eminent family, which is why Ilya simply cannot help but take first place. A little confused, but without slowing down, she angrily asked if this was really a good enough reason not to even look towards the first place. Looking away and with disappointment in his voice, Brad replied that it was not worth it, since it was not only her fighting skills themselves, but also her tenacity. An enraged Judith screamed that she was infuriated by this, and then asked why then arrange an exam, the result of which was predetermined. Running up to Brad, she continued to scream indignantly, asking what was so great about these noble families. Then she said that if they lose to an orphan commoner, then they won't even be able to raise their eyes in front of others. Hearing this, Brad was surprised. He stared at something behind Judith. She, a little confused, asked him where he was looking like that. Turning in the direction where her interlocutor was looking, she saw Elijah, who was looking intently at her. All the guys around were horrified by her arrival, saying that things were bad. Ilya was on edge. After a short pause, Elijah sounded like she didn't care that she was insulting her and her family. She screamed, looking at the offender, continuing that she was not at all affected by what people like her were talking about behind her back. No less furious, Judith invited her to fight. She was ready to rush at her, but Brad stopped her, saying that they could get expelled for fighting. Ilya was already leaving, but in the end she said that she would take first place this time too, and would continue to take it time after time. Brad watched all this, not trusting her words, and Ilya said that she had no use for her family's sword technique, and only one academy program was enough to prove that she was head and shoulders above everyone else. Suddenly, Brad broke loose and ran towards her, asking her to wait. Stopping in front of her, with hatred in his eyes, he said that the family technique of the Lynch sword is the sword of heaven. This name was established after her family caught the king of demonic fights 400 years ago. Turning to him, Elijah asked, "So what?" Smiling, Brad said he would like to see how good this technique was. Hearing his wish, she turned away from him and began to leave, telling him to stop dreaming. Then Brad, with complete confidence in his voice, told her that if she did not show the heavenly sword technique then. He fell silent for a while, after which he replied that the first place would be his. Hearing this was offensive to Elijah, causing her to stop, holding back her anger. At this time, Iron was training with the sword. Looking at the sword in his hands, his eyes were filled with bitterness. Iron's thought sounds that these sensations are not all the same. He is very tired, sweat is streaming down his face. His thought was heard again that it clearly seemed to him that he had become closer. He remembered his dreams, where that same long-haired tall man appeared in front of him. Iron ran towards him, stretching his hand towards him. But lately he has the impression that, on the contrary, he is only gradually moving away. The thought was voiced that he needed to concentrate again. Sitting in the lotus position, Iron began to meditate. Suddenly it dawned on him. The thought flashed through my head, what if for the sake of similarity? Iron took the sword in his hands. Try to meditate with a sword in your hands, he continued his thought. Holding the sword in his hand, he closed his eyes and began to meditate. At this time, at the academy, during training, a blow whistled through the air. The sword in the hands of one of the students flew out, causing him to spread his arms and say that he was giving up. Brad's voice sounded in the distance, praising them as hard workers. Both students greeted the gentleman. Coming closer to them, he, with a smile on his face, told one that he began to train harder. He immediately answered him that the final assessment would begin soon, however. Without finishing, he imagined people fighting with swords in his head, after which he said that Brad had a huge influence on everyone. He was surprised, asking if he did it. The guy continued with a smile on his face that what he said to Elijah that day served as a great incentive. A little embarrassed and looking away, Brad said he didn't remember him saying anything special. At that moment, Judith approached them, telling Brad to stop making faces. Taking the sword in her hands, she ordered Brad to raise his weapon. The battle has begun. The guys struck blow after blow at each other, but each of them was blocked. They fought on equal terms, not wanting to give in to each other. But at one point, Judith missed the attack, and the blade of Brad's blade was in front of her face. Reacting quickly, she managed to dodge, and in her thoughts there was only the realization that he had become faster. With all her might she tried to strike back. Suddenly, in her peripheral vision, she noticed that her opponent's blade was again close to her face. She carried out a sharp and quick blow that cut through the air. At the last second, she managed to block the blow, saving herself from defeat. At this moment, Judith's thought was heard that he was simply insightful. A sharp pain shot through Judith. In her head, she realized that there was a calmness in him that was not there before. After this thought, she launched a sharp attack, which Brad easily and quickly dodged. It sounds like an unfinished thought that at this rate, he will actually be able to do it. Tired, Judith was catching her breath, trying to come to her senses. Looking at Brad, she saw that he was standing and ready to attack to end the fight. Seeing him so strong, the thought in her mind that was unfinished ended with him being able to pass Ilya and take first place in the rankings. Judith, with fear in her eyes, realized that now she could not defeat him. In her head, she said those words about thinking bigger, spoken by Brad at the very beginning. She smiled, not about to give up. Completing her thought, she said that those very words served as a lesson to her and that she would not rush. After these words, with a malicious smile on her face, she again stood up, preparing to defend herself. The thought flashed through her mind about how she would officially become a student at the academy. Then he will defeat him. At this point, Brad came out of his stance and exhaled in a relaxed manner. Coming closer to her, he asked her to finish for today so as not to overwork herself too much before the final assessment. Ready to continue the battle, Judith was confused. Quickly realizing what had happened, she grabbed her uniform and began to noticing that she was not even angry. Brad noticed this, saying that green snow would fall. Then Judith said that she had something to do. Looking at her departing rival, Brad asked what was going on with her, to which she replied that the curious Varvara's nose had been torn off at the market. Looking at her with a malicious smile, Brad barely chuckled. Looking at his sword, he grinned. The thought crossed his mind that he had indeed changed. Cutting the air in front of him, he said that his goal was not impossible. And now he's thinking. Ilya appeared before his eyes with frightened eyes. Continuing his thought, he said that he could indeed aim for a seat next to her as well. Iron's two-handed sword appeared before his eyes. Smiling, he continued that now he would be able to withstand the blow of his sword. Iron at this time was training with his hands bandaged. His eyes are full of fatigue. His thoughts were that even with changing his stance, there was no improvement. Iron was desperate. He didn't understand what to do or what to do. Suddenly, he was distracted by Judith's voice. She asked him if he was tired of being stuck on the training ground all the time. With a smile on her face, she invited him to go outside for a while and get some fresh air. It's evening outside, and Ilya comes out of the building, when suddenly something caught her attention. These were the silhouettes of Judith and Iron, who were heading somewhere. After walking a little more, they reached a small hillock, where they settled down. They looked at the beautiful evening sky, which was full of clouds. Breaking the silence, Judith asked with interest how his preparations were going. Not expecting such a question, Iron asked her what kind of preparation she was doing. Grinning at the answer, Judith said that there was less than half a month left until the final assessment. Lowering his head, Iron replied that he was still training hard. Hearing this answer, Judith yawned and said that he answered somewhat sluggishly. Iron looked at Judith and asked in response what she thought about herself, whether she thought she would pass. Placing her hands under her head, she replied that she would pass unconditionally, adding that she should not have asked that, but whether she could defeat Elijah. "Can you defeat her?" Iron asked. Birds were flying in the sky, and at this time Judith said that Iron was tactless. Judith fell silent. After a few seconds, she apologized to Iron. He looked at her, surprised, yawning again. Judith apologized for not paying attention to him lately, because she herself said that she would train with him in battle and correct his incorrect stances. Smiling, a little embarrassed, Iron said that everything was fine and that there was no need to apologize over trifles. Before he could finish speaking, Judith said that she was an orphan. The stunned Iron cast a sharp glance at her. Then she continued that she did not start this conversation in order to be pitied. Memories of the time when she was little and stole food from the shelves surfaced in her head. She said that as a small child, she had to survive by any means. All she knew how to do was steal and pickpocket. However, suddenly looking around her, it became clear to her that other people were dragging out their existence in the same way. She remembered the moment where, standing around the corner, she watched a man in an alley beating another to death. After leaving her memories, she said that living in this way, up until now, She did not feel gratitude to anyone and did not say thank you. Sitting up and looking into the distance, she said that that's why when Iron pulled her out of the lake, she should have thanked him for saving her. But she just got angry, adding that in truth, even now she doesn't feel comfortable saying thank you openly. After a brief silence, she continued that that was why she was going to return the favor through her own methods. Looking at Iron, she said, "Come in." He didn't understand what she meant. Then Judith clarified that he must definitely pass the final assessment. With a smile on her face and joy in her eyes, she told him to become an official student of the academy. Then she asked him to allow her to help him normally. Iron's face lit up, and he replied that he would do it. Standing up, a flushed Judith began to walk away. Waving to her friend, she told him to wait about 5 minutes and go. Looking at her, Iron had a question in his mind. Was it she who should have asked for forgiveness? Without looking up from her, he continued to say in his head that those who over the past 2 months, paid due attention. He fell silent, watching as Judith almost disappeared around the corner and in his head. Then he continued that such a person was, in fact, him. Looking away and looking into the distance, he said that he had managed to change a lot. He saw a beautiful view, the sky, forests, mountains, and thought that before he spent all his time in bed, but now he was sitting and looking at the sky. The first year at the academy wasn't that bad. The thought flashed through his mind that he recognized himself a little better. As he watched the clouds, with a smile on his face, he said in his thoughts that he was grateful for everything he can feel now and for his current thoughts. When he returned to the academy, he realized that Judith, Brad, Elijah, as well as the head of the academy and the instructors had helped him a lot. Taking the sword in his hands again and taking a stance, he said that now it was time to repay them for their support. Suddenly, he felt something. It was a yellow flash of energy in the open sky, dotted with stars. Closing his eyes, he began to emit a barely noticeable yellow aura. Concentrating, he was completely enveloped in this aura. The day of the final assessment arrived. An instructor aimed was shouting furiously. In the center of the arena stood 3 silhouettes, and in front of them were all the students of the academy. The final assessment has begun. There was a tree leaf in the air. The first participant was surrounded by these sheets, had a sword in his hand, closed his eyes and concentrated. Making a lunge, he cut all the leaves at once with one blow. The chief and aimed were the judges. Seeing what the guy did, the old man said that his accuracy and speed were excellent. The next participant stood in front of the stand with the stone, raising his sword. With one strong blow, he cut the stone. The cut was oblique and looked very smooth. The manager closed his eyes and said that everyone was performing beyond expectations, but he was still a little upset. Standing up, Aimed was ready to name the next student. It turned out to be Judith. With full confidence, she stepped forward. Stopping in front of the principal's desk, she asked if she could take the test with another student. The old man did not understand what she was talking about, so he asked what she was talking about. With a smile on her face, Judith said that she thought a duel would allow the two of them to more fully demonstrate their strengths. After listening to her, the manager said that it would be interesting, and then asked who her partner would be. Brad emerged from the crowd. Standing opposite each other, they prepared for a duel. Standing up, Brad asked if she was ready. Judith was in no hurry to answer, turning the sword over in her hand. She called his name and fell silent. Brad looked at her, waiting for an answer. Judith said she didn't want to rush it, but it didn't look like it would work out. Particles from previous trials were flying around the battle site. Standing up, Judith shouted that she would surpass him today. Grinning, Brad said that it was just like her. The battle began. Judith crouched, preparing to jump. The jump was across half the arena. She slammed her sword against Brad's. A frantic battle began. All attacks were blocked, and no one was going to concede victory. Everyone gathered was shocked by what they saw. There was an incredible roar in the room from the collision. Meanwhile, Brad began to lose ground, groaning and barely holding back Judith's onslaught. At the same time, Judith was serious. She lunged forward and prepared to throw a side kick. She quickly and deftly moved her feet and prepared for the blow. A quick side kick with a sword went right over Brad's head, who managed to duck. Brad started to lose his balance, and Judith wanted to take advantage of it. Having swung, she had to strike the sword from top to bottom to deliver the final blow. But it was not to be. Brad managed to dodge again, and Judith's attack passed right in front of his face. Everyone was shocked. Everything happened so quickly. While there was time, Brad jumped back to keep his distance. But Judith was not going to let him go so quickly. She jumped after him, continuing to attack him. Seizing the moment, Brad carried out the attack with a deft blow. The attack should have hit Judith unconditionally, but she, noticing the attack, jumped up, dodging it. Looking up in complete surprise, Brad was confused. Preparing for the attack, Judith already swung. A powerful downward blow was aimed at the opponent, but Brad managed to block her attack and remained unharmed. Looking at them, Lung was amazed. They were amazing. Attack after attack, movement after movement. Their skirmishes took place throughout the arena, in which it was not even possible to discern what was happening. At that moment, Judith spun like a tornado to strike. She delivered blow after blow. Watching their fight, Aim set in his head that Judith's blows were merciless. Brad could parry every blow while remaining unharmed. Then Aim set in his head that Brad was easily fending off her extremely powerful attacks. Brad was about to lunge and attack Judith. Bypassing each of her attacks, he made a lunge aimed directly at his opponent. But Judy managed to notice the merciless blow and ducked, bending her body back. But then blood sprayed from her cheek. She immediately jumped some distance away. Blood flowed from her cheek. Judith got angry, calling her opponent a goat. Smiling contentedly and preparing to attack, Brad asked if she was hoping to defeat him with this. The battle began again. Blow after blow, they mercilessly attacked each other. Judith's thoughts were that she needed to be even stronger, and Brad's thoughts were that she needed to be even more precise. At one moment, everything merged into a huge massacre, at the epicenter of which there was a white glow. The entire arena was covered in clouds of dust. Nothing was visible. Paul could barely withstand such tension. Judith stood unharmed, but her sword was broken. Brad stood opposite her, but his sword was intact. They looked at each other. No one else attacked anyone. Holding the broken sword in her hand, Judith's thoughts sounded, in which she said that in the end, nothing worked out for her. The judges were amazed, saying that they were practically on the same level, but nevertheless, he turned out to be more skillful than they fell silent. The judges looked at Brad, who was still standing. After thinking a little, they continued that Brad was more skillful. Jumping up from his seat, the leader began to clap for them, saying that it was an amazing duel and that both were great fellows. Bowing, Judith and Brad thanked the old man.